through rules and regulations. We need to do it by law, and ghost guns should be prohibited. Now there's some newfangled deal that I've come across in the city of Memphis where they've intercepted some metal parts that have come in from China that turn pistols into semi-automatic weapons into fully automatic weapons. Customs and Border Protection in Memphis have seized 40 devices recently that turn semi-automatic handguns to fully automatic. Now we're working on that. That should be prohibited too. There's something wrong in America, and this committee needs to deal with it today, and it will. I appreciate Mr. Cicilline's bill that does ban assault weapons. I had an amendment to do that today because it needed to be debated and it needs to be enacted. But for considerations, Mr. Cicilline's precedence on this bill, I'm not going to offer it today. But we need to pass it, and we need to pass everything here, and it's time that our Republican colleagues stopped offering just thoughts and prayers, but offered solutions and cared about the people who are dying. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purposes the gentleman from Arizona seeking recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the day after the Uvalde shooting, I had the opportunity to meet with CBP Chief Ortiz and also talk with marshals who were on the scene in that school. I happened to be in South Texas at that time. And it is not a tragedy. It is beyond a tragedy. A tragedy imputes some kind of non-intentional or accidental event. This was beyond that. This was a deliberate, malicious, evil event by this 18-year-old young man. And so it's beyond a tragedy, and it most certainly does need to be addressed and needs to be investigated further. There have been multiple accounts, as there normally would be, from parents, from law enforcement who was on the scene, from Border Patrol agents, the BORTAC unit, et cetera. I hope that we can get to the bottom of exactly what transpired there so we understand it more fully. I also express more than just heartfelt thoughts towards the families who were affected and the community itself that was impacted by this. But I also think it's important, Mr. Chairman, to consider a whole host of additional pieces of information. And I'm throughout the course of the day, I will submit various studies, articles dealing with these gun shootings. For instance, Mr. Chairman, I submit for the record a piece entitled "Chicago's had most mass shootings in the U.S. since 2018. What's the solution?"
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's from CBS Chicago that was discussing that post Uvalde. And also, Mr. Chairman, another piece called "Chicago had 971 shootings in the first half of the year, while violence is trending down from the pandemic peak. It is still way too high."
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The left and the Democrats' response to virtually every problem is to take more power and control into the national government and take away individual rights or throw taxpayers' money at the problem, sometimes both. That's why they tend to exacerbate virtually every problem without resolution. They misidentify the cause of virtually every effect. The misuse of guns for criminal or even evil purposes is another example. Millions of Americans safely and responsibly own and use guns. Previous Democrat-controlled departments of justice have conservatively estimated that guns are used 1.5 million times per year to save lives. I repeat, the Department of Justice under Democrat control and leadership under Democrat administrations have done their studies and conservatively estimated that guns are used 1.5 million times per year to save lives. Other studies have put that number as high as 2.5 million times per year that a gun is used to save life. Most of the time, the vast majority of the time, it is merely by brandishing a weapon that that stops the violent criminal conduct without having to shoot. The idea that disarming Americans who lawfully, legally own guns, the idea that disarming them will produce a safer, crime-free America is simply not true. I will be going into the Australia studies I will go into the 17-nation international studies as we go throughout this day. We will review again in my comments from time to time, the Chicago, Portland, New York City, Seattle, and other bastions of left-wing gun-controlled areas where the public is not safer because of the gun control laws. In fact, they are more at risk. Mr. Chairman, this is an important hearing. I think it's probably premature in relationship and being driven by the response to Uvalde, and I understand that. But I also think that sometimes visceral reactions might overshadow the statement of facts that we need to discuss. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition? Ms. Garcia.
I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And for many of us in Texas, our souls are crushed, our hearts are broken, but many minds are wondering, why is this still happening? No, this is not rushing. No, it's not premature. 23 years have passed since Columbine, and the time is now to act. Enough is enough. We cannot allow another disgrace like what happened in Uvalde to tear apart one more community and to tear up more families. Jacqueline Cáceres, Makina Lee Elrod, Jose Manuel Flores, Ileana Garcia, Irma Garcia, Isaiah Garcia, Ameri Joe Garza, Javier Lopez, J.C. Carmelo Loivamos, Tess Mata, Miranda Mathis, Eva Mireles, Elithaya Ramirez, Annabel Rodriguez, Maitai Rodriguez, Alexandria Lexi Rubio, Leila Salazar, Jayla Nicole Silgorio, Eliana Cruz Torres, Rogelio Torres. These are the names of the 19 children and 2 teachers, innocent lives tragically lost. Children, now angels, watching us from above to see what we are doing. One young man pulled the trigger, but we all have failed them. America has failed them, and the other thousands of children that have died as a result of gun violence. Republicans are complicit in Uvalde's negligence and neglect to responsibly address comprehensive gun reform. Republicans are complicit in the shooter in Buffalo for encouraging white supremacy and promoting replacement theory. Republicans are complicit of the lives lost at Pulse, Florida, for their homophobic and anti-human rights narrative. Republicans are complicit in the massacre in El Paso for their anti-Latino, anti-immigrant narrative and for putting gun lobbying interests above people's lives. House Democrats stand with the victims and their loved ones. We stand to act for the people, not gun interests. We have been consistent. We are not rushing. We have already passed some bills. They're all solutions. They're not premature. We have passed reforms and measures to ensure that we're protecting our communities and most especially our little children, our angels. The community that was assaulted here in Texas was a predominantly Latino community. So to my neighbors in Uvalde, I say this, no los vamos a olvidar. No vamos a olvidar los nombres y las caras de los 19 niños que perdieron su vida. No olvidamos los responsables de esta tragedia. Seguimos luchando hasta cuando ya pasemos reformas de la violencia de armas de fuego. Gracias. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. McClintock seek recognition?
To speak on the amendment.
Clerk will report the amendment.
No, he's talking about the nature of a substitute.
Oh, the gentleman strikes the last word. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the atrocity in Uvalde is shocking and heartbreaking in so many ways. The slaughter of innocents is the greatest of all human crimes, and I think it rightly prompts soul searching by all men and women of goodwill for the causes and remedies. It's disturbing, though, some have used this and other recent attacks to justify either partisan attacks, like we just heard, or policies as before us today to make it harder for law-abiding citizens to obtain firearms in the hope that by doing so, that someday maybe they'll become unavailable to the lawless. Well, I think this overlooks the obvious immediate action that is long overdue in this world of sin and woe. You know, if you walk into any bank in this country, you'll see at least one armed guard whose purpose is to protect our money with lethal force. And yet at Uvalde and in so many other school shootings, we were not willing to protect our children with the same force as we protect our money. No one gives a second thought to an armed guard at a bank, yet the left is outraged by the mere suggestion of placing an armed guard at every school filled with innocent children. And when are we going to get serious and take the world as it is rather than how we wish it should be? Even for those trained and licensed to carry concealed weapons, it was against both state and federal law to bring a firearm into the Robb Elementary School. Every administrator, every teacher, every janitor obeyed that law. The only person who didn't was the madman. And that, in a nutshell, is the danger of gun control laws. You know, we have more than 50 years of experience now with these laws. They are extremely effective at disarming law-abiding citizens, as they were that tragic day in Uvalde. They are extremely ineffective at disarming madmen and criminals, as they also were that day. They create an environment where the gunman is king. Now, after every tragedy, politicians rush to pass more gun control laws, as we're doing today. We've been doing this now for 50 years. If these laws actually worked, wouldn't things be getting better by now rather than worse? The proportion of households with firearms has dropped significantly in the last 40 years. Shouldn't things be getting better and not worse? Meanwhile, we've neglected the obvious. The dangerously mentally ill are not confined and treated as they were in the past. I calculated in California alone, we'd have roughly 100,000 more mentally ill confined in mental facilities today if we maintained the same proportion of the population as in 1960. Those 100,000 dangerously mentally ill are out on our streets instead. Secondly, gun criminals often escape prosecution at the hands of woke district attorneys. Let me give you just one example. Hunter Biden illegally acquired a handgun despite being an admitted drug addict, a handgun that ended up being taken out of a public trash can 500 feet from a school. He also lied on his firearms application. Nobody's prosecuting him despite there being no dispute as to the facts. Why not? But most obviously and immediately, in almost every one of these atrocities, there was no shoot back. Now, ironically, just such an event happened the very next day in Charleston, West Virginia. A criminal with an AR-15 style rifle approached a graduation party. He fired into the crowd but missed. Moments later, a woman with a concealed weapons permit returned fire and killed him on the spot. You probably haven't heard of that incident because on that occasion, there was a good guy with the freedom to return fire. That freedom was denied at Robb Elementary School. You know, if we could actually banish all guns from all criminals, sign me up. But I suspect that gun laws will be about as effective at keeping guns out of the hands of madmen and terrorists and criminals as our drug laws have been at keeping drugs out of the hands of addicts. The difference is the drug laws don't disarm law-abiding citizens from defending themselves. Gun laws do. The one thing we can do right now, this instant, that will have an immediate effect in stopping such slaughters is to assure that every school has the same protection as your average bank and that every school official with the training and licensing can carry a concealed weapon if they choose. And if we're not willing to take that simple, immediate, and wholly effective step, then we're obviously not serious about stopping these outrages. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island seek recognition?
I move to strike the word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I want to begin by thanking you for this markup and for bringing this really important piece of legislation to the committee. Guns have become the leading cause of death for American kids. Let that sink in, the leading cause of death. And for those who have said, oh, we're rushing this, more than 311,000 students have experienced gun violence since Columbine. So tell the parents who lost children, tell the family members who saw loved ones slaughtered that we're rushing. The real question is, why has it taken us so long? And there's one reason. We don't have Republican colleagues in the fight with us. We passed 2 bills to strengthen criminal background checks. Our ranking member just described those as radical attempts to take away the Second Amendment to explain Republican inaction in the Senate. That's a bill supported by 90% of the American people. Common sense, as well as closing the Charleston loophole. Enough with these bogus arguments about the Second Amendment. This is about fulfilling our responsibility to keep our constituents safe from gun violence. We have a gun violence epidemic in this country. Over 200 mass shootings, 27 school shootings just this year. And every one of those victims is a child, a sister, a brother, a parent, a loved one of people that we have a responsibility to represent in this country and in this Congress. This set of proposals will significantly reduce gun violence in this country. There's not a single bill we can pass that will eliminate all gun violence. We'd all be for that. But this will make sure that you have to be old enough to have some mature judgment before you can own an assault rifle, that you can't use high-capacity magazines that can slaughter innocents at a quicker pace, that we end gun trafficking and straw purchases that help criminals get guns, that we practice safe storage, eliminate bump stocks, and eliminate ghost guns so you can't secretly produce a gun and then do damage. And the ranking member said, well, these bills punish law-abiding citizens. What one of those bills punishes anyone? And even if you think it's some small burden, it pales in comparison to the burden and the punishment that victims of gun violence have had to experience. So save this claim that somehow this is just too much for law-abiding gun owners. It's just not true. And we have an opportunity today, and I was hoping when we came to Washington for this emergency markup in direct response to gun violence continuing to ravage our country, that we would be met with colleagues on the other side of the aisle who would join us in this effort. These bills, the 5 components of this bill, have been introduced for a long time, some of them over multiple Congresses. These are not new issues. But our approach ought to be different today. We ought to work together in a bipartisan way and pass this bill out of this committee so we can demonstrate to the American people that we are committed to doing everything in our power to reduce gun violence in this country. And, you know, we've heard these same tired arguments that somehow we can't do this because the Constitution prohibits it. That is also not true. The Supreme Court of the United States has said time and time again that the Second Amendment is not absolute, that Congress and states have the ability, and I would say the responsibility, to ensure that there are appropriate restrictions both on age, on places where you can bring firearms, and the kind of firearms you can possess. That's long been recognized by the Supreme Court. So don't let our Republican colleagues hide behind this claim that, oh, we'd love to do something. We really know this is a serious problem. We extend our thoughts and prayers, and we would do more, but you know, the Second Amendment prohibits it. That is not true. Their refusal to join us in this effort is a direct result of the power and the resources of the gun lobby in America. And really the importance of just the proliferation of gun sales, because that's how the gun lobby makes its money. And so then they don't want any restriction, any limitation on how many guns can be sold and as quickly as possible to anyone who wants them. That's not the kind of America we want to live in. And I think for the sake of my constituents, for the sake of young people, seniors, all victims of gun violence, we have a responsibility to do something. And I hope this is the second package of gun safety bills we'll do. I hope we'll do more. And then it will be incumbent on our colleagues in the Senate to send these bills to the president's desk. And if they don't, it will be clear to the American people who's fighting for common sense gun safety legislation and who is standing in the way. And it will explain why we continue to be a country that has a gun violence epidemic. We cannot allow this to continue. I urge my colleagues to support this act, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes Mr. Bishop seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
You know, I was just thinking, so I'm going to take up the gentleman from Rhode Island's challenge. He just said that there's really not any significant constitutional issue at stake whatsoever, that the Constitution doesn't prohibit this. It seems to me that you'd have to know, wouldn't you? I mean, I looked at the majority guidance, staff guidance on this, and it has this one sentence about talking about some states having adopted bans on 18 to 20-year-olds.
If the gentleman will yield, I'm happy to answer that.
I've had your time. Let me speak to it for a minute so I can thicken the plot. Just a minute, Mr. Cicilline. You said that, or the majority guidance says, yet these laws, speaking of bans in some states on semi-automatic rifles being banned to 18 to 20-year-olds, so yet these laws have been challenged in the federal courts. They referenced two cases, didn't say anything else about it. Well, I decided to read them. And so the Jones versus Bonta case from the Ninth Circuit, one of the most liberal circuits in the country, federal case, just came down last month that said California's ban on the sale of centerfire of semi-automatic rifles to 18 to 20-year-olds violates the Constitution. It says that it goes through this long analysis of the history of the Second Amendment and says those rights to self-defense at the core of the Second Amendment, that 18 to 20-year-olds are covered by that right. They say, just like virtually every other, in fact, I think every other, right in the Bill of Rights applies to 18 to 20-year-olds. And there's another case. There's a case from the Fourth Circuit, from where I come from. It was vacated for mootness after being issued, but it was an analysis of the federal ban on sales of handguns to 18 to 20-year-olds. And it said, this came to the same conclusion, that the Second Amendment applies. And even the dissenting judge there said, here the majority has done careful historical research and has assembled persuasive evidence that young adults aged 18 to 20 had Second Amendment rights at the time the amendment was ratified. So when we undertake to do something, in the words of the gentlelady from Texas, isn't it incumbent on the House Judiciary Committee to consider, to evaluate what the Constitution allows Congress to do consistent with the supreme law of the land? So at least two parts of this proposed hodgepodge raise questions about constitutionality. The ban on the sale of semi-automatic rifles and shotguns to 18 to 20-year-olds, and also the provision about gun storage at home. Heller, by the United States Supreme Court, spoke to that. Why would there be no analysis or no consideration? But there's a willingness to just ram through this package, and the answer is, we don't have any patience for you if you're objecting. The voices are raised, the accusations are made, Republicans are complicit. I can tell you this, and let me be clear, you are not going to bully your way into stripping Americans of fundamental rights. And it also, unfortunately, it follows a pattern that we've discussed before. Just a couple of weeks ago, you ran through a bill concerning amicus briefs in the Supreme Court require the disclosure of charitable organization donors in violation of their First Amendment rights of association. I pointed it out then, that you had attempted to do, the same party had attempted to do the same thing in the NAACP case in Alabama, that you did the same thing, not coincidentally, in California, since we're talking about the California, the Ninth Circuit decision. In another case involving Mr. Bonta, the Attorney General out there, just last year, you just blundered right over that because you don't care. You're cavalier about the leak of the draft opinion from the Supreme Court. You want to pack the Supreme Court.
If the gentleman will yield, I'm happy to answer your question.
No, I think I've answered the question, but I'd be glad
Not
to say,
accurately.
You're in the disregard what the Ninth Circuit has said the
No,
law of the
I'm
land
actually
is?
bound by the Supreme Court of the United States, and I'd like to read the quote to you if you'll allow me, since you raised the question.
Look, I think the issue is what that Ninth Circuit case
Well,
said
the-
on the subject.
the
you're
United States
choosing to
Supreme Court
legislate. I
takes
don't
precedence
yield.
over the Ninth Circuit.
I don't yield. You'll have plenty of time.
Mr.
Your allies form mobs outside justices' homes. Yeah. You say look, you've got to figure out something else other than stripping people of their constitutional rights. We've got to figure out something else, assuming that the majority entertains a discussion. But you cannot, the courts have made it pretty clear, you cannot deprive young adults any more than the remainder of Americans of their core Second Amendment right to self-defense by the purchase and possession of weapons that are in common use and prevalent. And I'll say one, well, I'm out of time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purposes Ms. Dean seek recognition?
To strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for calling us to this emergency markup of the Protecting Our Kids Act. It is timely. In fact, we've all been clamoring for this kind of legislation for a very, very long time. I'm stunned by some of the words that we're hearing on the other side of the aisle. Where is their outrage over the slaughter of 19 fourth graders and their 2 teachers? Why don't they feel an urgency to do something? I'm reminded of the John Donne poem that ends, "Do not ask for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. It tolls for us." We have to stop saying, oh, where was the shooting? Tulsa? Buffalo? Uvalde? Parkland? Stop asking for whom the bell tolls. Whose funerals are we watching this week? It tolls for us. Our souls are being drenched out of this society. Before I discuss the important merits of the legislation, let's ground the debate in these last 2 slaughters. Actually, they're not the last, but the 2 that were some of the urgency that brought us here. On May 14th, 2020, 10 Black people were killed in a racist mass shooting, simply shopping for groceries. Roberta Drury, 32. Marcus Morrison, 52. Andre McNeil, 53. Aaron Salter, 55. Geraldine Talley, 62. Celestine Cheney, 65. Hayward Patterson, 67. Catherine Massey, 72. Pearl Young, 77. Ruth Whitfield, 86. It's untimely that we're here. What's untimely is being slaughtered in a supermarket by an 18-year-old with an assault-style weapon that he bought himself too, sort of as a birthday celebration, with hundreds of rounds of ammunition. You're worried about restricting that purchase and that slaughter, and you're not worried about the untimely deaths of 10 Black people in a supermarket. And only 10 days later, 19 children and 2 teachers killed, and I know you heard the names, but I'm going to say their first names again. Kenna, Layla, Miranda, Nevaeh, Jose, Xavier. These are all 10 and 11-year-olds, I should be saying. Tess, 10. Roleo, 10. Ellie, 9. Elihana, 10. Annabelle, 10. Jackie, 9. Uzziah, 10. Jace, 10. Mate, 10. Jaliyah, 10. Ameri, 10. Lexi, 10. Alethea, 10. And their teachers, Irma, 48, and Eva, 44. As we have heard, one of the children called twice, at least twice, said, "Send the police." One of the children recounted how she took the blood of her dead friend lying near her and smeared herself with that blood to pretend to be dead. What have we taught our children? This is on our watch. Where is the outrage? I will tell my friends on the other side of the aisle who, for some reason, stand against these common sense measures that would save lives, not all lives, but would save lives. You're way behind the curve. Gun owners, Americans, by and large, want these measures. I don't know what bubble you're living in. I guess surrounded by a powerful gun lobby trying to hold on to your seats. But America is way ahead of you. The outrage is real. We didn't learn it after Columbine. We didn't learn it after Sandy Hook. Please, God, let us stop the shame on our country, pass these laws, say that an 18-year-old cannot go in and slaughter our children or black people because they don't like black people. Join us. Join us in saving lives. We couldn't have a more important job to do. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back for purpose. This is a gentleman from Florida. Seek recognition.
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I'll confess I don't know much about the gun lobby that my colleague referenced because I don't meet with any lobbyists. I don't take their donations, and I don't take any donations from any of the political action committees that are for or against any of these measures. But I can speak for law-abiding gun owners who are very concerned about some of the bills that are before us. It is reflexive and it is irresponsible to consider bills while we're still trying to figure out what happened in some of these circumstances that you suggest animated the need for this hearing. The chairman referenced Uvalde in the first moments of this hearing, but yet we're still deciphering key elements of the law enforcement response, of the physical plant, of points of intrusion. And it is not kind, and it is not compassionate to tell people that you're doing something to help them when in fact you have no idea whether or not this legislation that you fashioned would in fact do that. I would suggest that it's potentially cruel to tell people that they've inspired a response to a tragedy when in fact that response won't work. Who would want to be associated with such a thing? My colleagues asked the question, where's the outrage? I would observe that perhaps outrage isn't the most responsible and pensive way to write a bill, to address a problem. I heard on Sunday Senator Chris Murphy praise the Florida legislation in response to the violence in Parkland, and while there's a lot in that legislation I didn't like, mainly the gun control, there were provisions that I think we could work on that have made schools safer in Florida. For example, no longer leaving schools as gun-free zones, as soft targets in many cases, has improved the force multiplier for law enforcement. In fact, of Florida's 67 counties, 45 have opted into the Sentinel program we created in our state to get rid of the gun-free zones and to allow former members of our military, tactical operators, former members of law enforcement, to be there for their children to keep them safe so that we don't have to relive these tragedies. There was also training that was actually required, mandatory, rigorous in Florida. That would be something that we might want to think about and might want to encourage. But it is similarly irresponsible here in the Judiciary Committee for us to just ignore the jurisprudence that's happening around the country. When you have the Ninth Circuit, the Fourth Circuit, the notion that you can't just deprive someone of their Second Amendment rights who's committed no offense other than not having achieved the age of 21 once they're an American adult. I sort of like Congressman Massey's legislation that maybe everyone who's a voter or on their way to vote ought to have the opportunity to carry a firearm to ensure that they're not subject to any intimidation. I heard my colleague, Mr. Cohen, talk about the need to pass this legislation despite the fact that it will stop law-abiding citizens from being able to exercise their right. And I guess that is the accepted collateral damage. What people need to hear is that stopping law-abiding citizens from exercising their rights is okay, even in a world in which we're not making school shootings less likely because we're not appropriately tailoring the remedy to the problem. We've got all this ghost guns and gun tracking legislation up today. Were any of these school shootings, were any of these guns ghost guns? You know, and so it seems to be sort of gun control in search of a tragedy to lash onto to animate the desire to have more gun control. And I believe the gentleman from Tennessee also said, well, it'll also stop the non-law abiding. And perhaps we should realize that our laws don't have their own fiat, right? They aren't in and of themselves determinative of human behavior. And to suggest, you know, I was watching the NBA Finals, and I heard Shaquille O'Neal observe that in the communities that he's familiar with, the access to guns is not the problem. Anybody can get the guns. And maybe if that's true, and he was speaking of course, non-legal ways to get guns, maybe we ought to focus on the circumstances that cause these people to commit these shootings. Maybe we ought to get rid of the gun-free zones that are causing this scourge of violence. And maybe we ought to really put the victims first, not through virtue signaling, but through pensive, thoughtful legislation.
Gentleman yields back for our purposes. The gentlelady from Georgia seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
We are paying for gun violence every single day of our lives. We are paying for the weapons of war on our streets with the blood of children sitting in our schools. We are paying for unfettered access with mothers and fathers waiting in line for a DNA test, forced to find out if it's their child that's riddled with bullets and maimed beyond recognition. We are paying for this deadly culture with the lives of the American people, with the lives of who we in this room are sworn to protect. Do we have the courage right here in this body to imagine the phone call parents across Uvalde received last week? The phone call that confirms our fear, our singular fear that my child is dead and that I was unable to protect them, because I know that phone call. Parents across the country know that phone call. It's a sucker punch to my stomach every time I learn there's another phone call. A phone call that brings you to your knees when the desperation will not let you stand, that leaves you gasping for air when the agony will not let you breathe. And for days and for months and for years, you cry out to God in your grief. Was my child afraid? Did he feel the pain as the bullets ripped through his skin? How long did it take him to die? Was it quick, or did he suffer? My son Jordan was only 17 years old when he was shot by a man with a gun who didn't like the loud music that he was playing. I had dreamed of who he would become. I had dreamed of watching him walk across the stage for his high school graduation, filled with excitement for college, hope for his future, and dreams for the world that only a teenager can have. The same racially motivated violence that took my son, that murdered 10 Black Americans in Buffalo, is being replayed with casual callousness and despicable frequency. Since last week, when 19 children were gunned down at their desks, we have lost over 700 Americans to gun violence. Last night, 4 Americans were murdered as they worked, murdered while they tried to mend, murdered while they tried to keep families whole. Are we okay with this as a nation? Is this the status quo that we all accept? What rights do we give our children as we bring them into this world? What rights has God given them as they grow in our homes and in our hearts? Do we enjoy the right to study in our schools without the fear of massacre? Do our children have the right to live free from the trauma that only stepping over a friend covered in blood could ever bring? Do parents enjoy the right to drop their kid off at a school and expect to see them come home? Do we as a nation have the God-given right to live free from this scourge of gun violence, of senseless suffering, of death and despair? Because we cannot keep doing this. An entire generation of children are learning that the adults they look up to cannot or will not protect them. We all agree that the status quo is unacceptable. We all understand that the murder of our children cannot continue. And we have solutions that a majority of American people believe in. They are common sense compromises that will keep American children alive. Solutions to protect our kids, to keep guns out of the hands of those who should not have them, and to stop our neighbors from being slaughtered in our schools, in our churches, and in our supermarkets. Throughout this nation's history, our elected leaders have risen to the task. And we have the opportunity to do this again right now as a nation, to do the right thing and address this moment in history. Because this is the time right now. This is the moment. It may be the only moment that we have. We are facing the challenge of our lifetime, and this is the issue of our era. And we must summon the courage to do what is right, the courage to protect our kids, and the courage, my God, we have to have the courage to protect America. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back for our purposes. Mr. Massey seek recognition.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Today we're debating a gun control bill that's actually 6 gun control bills in one. And why are there 6? Because none of them work. If you take 6 that don't work and put them together, they're not going to work. You can't make up for ineffective bills by having more than one or half a dozen of them. Each and every one of these gun control bills in this single title is unserious and unconstitutional and suffers from the problem, the inherent problem that almost all gun control suffers from. And that is criminals do not obey the law. They do not follow the law. Who here today thinks that criminals are going to read the Safe Storage Act and you know, some gang member is going to say, oh, I better lock this gun up or else they'll come and take it? Who here today thinks that a 19-year-old criminal is going to obey the restriction on age for having a gun? Nobody here believes this. These are unserious. But they're worse than that. They're going to compromise the rights and the safety of individual citizens, law-abiding citizens. Let me tell you the story of Nikki Gosser, who's testified here in Congress. And she worked for me in my congressional office. Nikki watched her husband get murdered in front of her viciously in a gun-free zone while her licensed firearm was in her car outside of the restaurant. That haunts her today. Ben and her had just recently been married, and they just wanted to be in this restaurant, and they followed the law, and he was murdered by her stalker in front of her. Now, she went on to get the laws changed in Tennessee to get rid of that gun-free zone. But that's one example, just one example of how all the rest of these are going to fail. The criminals do not follow the law. And the biggest thing we could do that nobody on the other side of the aisle is talking about today is to quit advertising our schools as soft zones, soft targets for defenseless teachers, defenseless staff, and students who aren't being defended. Congress itself in 1990 passed the Gun-Free School Zone Act. It's done more, it's cost more lives than it has saved. Now, some states have been able to override the Gun-Free School Zone Act and create their own areas. And in those states and those school districts where that's happened, where they've allowed qualified teachers and staff to carry, there hasn't been a single mass shooting in one of those schools. There hasn't been a single shooting of one person in one of those schools. The biggest thing we could do here today is to repeal the 1990 Gun-Free School Zone Act, so that the default condition in this country is not to advertise every student as a target. Now, to Mr. Cicilline's point, he was talking about the Supreme Court. You know, in 1995, the Gun-Free School Zone Act was struck down. Why was that? Because this document does not contain the authority to implement a Gun-Free School Zone Act. So what did Congress do? They resuscitated this unconstitutional bill by putting in a provision that says, well, as long as the gun is involved in interstate commerce, well, then we have the authority. Well, I wonder if that's the case with all 6 of these useless bills in here today, because only 2 of the bills say that. It's actually 2 of the bills say it only applies to firearms involved in interstate commerce. Does that mean the other 4 are unconstitutional? Or it actually means all 6 are unconstitutional, and they're trying to save 2 of them with the provision that killed the Gun-Free School Zone Act in 1995. By the way, they overturned Mr. Lopez's conviction, and he went on to serve in the Marines, the one who was convicted of violating the Gun-Free School Zone Act. But Congress came back and resuscitated it, and unconstitutionally so, but there is a conflict between these 6 bills. Some of them recognize the constitutional flaw, and some of them don't. And I want to close with this. Some of my colleagues have said that the assault weapons ban from 1994 to 2004 reduced mass public shootings by 40%. They make up a number a lot of times, but I'll take whatever number they use. Do they know that sales of AR-15 style weapons went up from 1994 to 2004? Because it was just a cosmetic ban. So if the assault weapons ban had any effect, how did it have an effect? The ownership and sales and transfer of AR-15 style weapons went up during that period. So I would just close by saying, you can't make a good law by putting 6 bad laws together. It's not going to work. It will infringe on our constitutional rights, and the Democrats don't seem to care. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Johnson of Georgia seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
You know, it's been 9 days since we lost 21 souls in Uvalde, Texas. 19 children and 2 teachers. We can't ignore our problem, which is out of control gun violence in America. We must lead, we must act, and we must act now. Acting now will take courage. Each of us on this committee should call forward some semblance of courage, like the courage that was on display last week by those brave Border Patrol agents who put their lives at risk to stop the carnage in Uvalde. I ask my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, can you put aside your thirst for raw power and muster the courage to stand up for our kids and against the NRA? My friends, history will not forget those politicians and the phony patriots who cared more about maintaining their grip on power and serving the interest of the NRA than they did about protecting our kids from out-of-control gun violence. Columbine, Sandy Hook, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, Virginia Tech, UC Santa Barbara, and the list goes on and on. And none of these heinous atrocities moved Congress to act. We must not let Uvalde be the same. Our constituents need to know that we hear from them and we will act on their behalf. The fact of the matter is that more than 311,000 students have experienced gun violence at school since Columbine. This violence, this carnage cannot be what America is all about. And the time for minor reforms is gone. Congress must take comprehensive legislative action to stop the murders of our children. In the name of all who have perished at the hands of a firearm, we must do something. In the name of Columbine, let's crack down on straw purchasers. In the name of Route 91, let's ban bump stocks. In the name of Sandy Hook, Pulse Nightclub, El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio, let's ban high-capacity magazines. In the name of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, Buffalo, and Uvalde, let's raise the age of purchase to 21 years of age. This misguided pledge that some of us have of allegiance to guns and yes, to the NRA, it must end. And it must end now, not tomorrow, not next year, but now. For the people of the United States demanding meaningful, effective action, let's pass the Protecting Our Kids Act. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purposes Mr. Tiffany seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Anytime we address gun violence, we should also address the state of affairs of our society. We should address crime and mental health. We must also address the family unit, forging the future of our society. Look at the story of the young man who did so much damage in Uvalde, Texas. None of the latter seems to get any attention from this body, and the knee-jerk reaction is to always punish law-abiding citizens for the sins of the few. The answer is always to place more restrictions on the masses instead of holding the individual accountable. The problem is not being addressed today. The majority, instead of working in good faith across the aisle to find real solutions to these problems, are now here talking about protecting our kids with a bill that does little of that. This bill ignores the real mental health crisis in the country. It ignores the countless failures by the FBI and local jurisdictions in failing to act on actionable information. It ignores how the defund the police movement influenced school districts across the US to rid themselves of school resource officers and police. It ignores the school systems trying to replace the family by withholding information from parents about their own children. This social experiment going on in our military, our schools, and our society is contributing to this mental health crisis, the deterioration of family values, and our skyrocketing violent crime rates. The question was posed by the lady from Pennsylvania. What have we taught our children? It is a very good question, and it's not being answered today. Unconstitutionally changing the age for ownership of a rifle from the 18 to 21, as has been so clearly stated by others on the committee, does little to address the root causes I've described. Neither is creating a gun owner database through the IRS, one of the provisions of the 6 in this bill. After all, the IRS has not had a great track record of keeping confidential information secure, has it? Moving the goalposts, as often is done, only gets some talking points. Real solutions require reaching across the aisle and addressing all of these issues, not messaging that exploits tragedies to try and take away our rights and eventually have to be struck down by the courts. And I really think that the majority should be honest here today with the American public, and you should come clean. And you should propose the amendment, which is what you really want, which is to repeal the Second Amendment to the Constitution, because that is really what is afoot and has been over the decades as we've had this robust argument here in our country for a long time. Come clean, tell the American people what you really want to do, Mr. Chairman, and that is repeal the Second Amendment. And I would just close by this. Uzziah Garcia has been mentioned a couple times during this hearing. God bless that young man, and may he rest in peace, along with all the others that perished in Uvalde. But I would also cite Uzziah Garcia's uncle, who said, do not politicize this. Do not politicize this before all the facts are known about what went on at that Uvalde school. With that, if I have any colleagues that would like time yielded to them, I'd be happy to do it.
I'd like you to yield to me if you wouldn't mind. I'm a colleague.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back to you.
Wow.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Jones, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the chairman of the full committee for convening this markup during recess so that we can advance the Protecting Our Kids Act. This is life-saving legislation, and it cannot wait. I'm proud to co-sponsor this bill, and I'm proud to support it today in committee. As the youngest member of this committee, I need to address my Republican colleagues on behalf of the generations of young people whom Republicans have condemned to grow up in fear that they will be gunned down at school. When I was just 11 years old, something that then seemed unthinkable happened. 2 students killed a teacher and 12 of their classmates at Columbine High School. I was afraid. All of us were. But still, I had hope that by the time I was in high school, nothing like the shooting at Columbine would ever happen again. I had faith that adults would step up. I never imagined that mass shootings, let alone school shootings, would become our new normal. Yet that is exactly what has happened. What was once unthinkable has come to feel, for many Americans, unstoppable. Since Columbine, more than 311,000 children have experienced gun violence at school. There were more school shootings last year than in any year since 1999, the year of Columbine. And there have been more than 200 mass shootings this year already. The leading cause of death of American children is now gun violence. Behind every one of those statistics is the story of a person, often a child, who mattered. Before we even had time to grieve for the 10 people murdered by a white supremacist in Buffalo, New York, my home state, another gunman killed 19 children and 2 adults in Uvalde, Texas. 4 children are orphans because their mother made the ultimate sacrifice, not on the battlefront in Iraq or in Eastern Europe, but in the classroom. And their grieving father died of a heart attack thereafter. A girl named Nevaeh, heaven spelled backwards, is in eternal rest at the age of 10. A badge of honor has been awarded posthumously for heroism, not to a police officer, but to a Girl Scout, murdered trying to call for help. To the parents who mourn and the children who fear, all you have to offer are more guns, and apparently the ridiculous idea of fewer school doors. My generation and the generations who have followed know that this epidemic of gun violence is not unstoppable. It is a choice you could make differently at any time, a choice between our lives and your guns. Time after time, we have given you a chance to do something. After Columbine, after Sandy Hook, after Parkland, and time after time, you have chosen to put your right to kill over our right to live. But your selfishness and your indifference have not killed our hope. You have transformed it. before we believed that you might do what the people overwhelmingly support and help advance common sense gun violence legislation. Now we know that it is up to us to save ourselves from you. We did not choose this fight. We had our own dreams for our lives, the same as you did when you were kids, but we can't let you get away with this anymore. Enough is enough. Enough of you telling us that school shootings are a fact of life when every other country like ours has virtually ended it. Enough of you blaming mental illness and then defunding mental health care in this country. Enough of your thoughts and prayers. Enough. Enough. You will not stop us from advancing the Protecting Our Kids Act today. You will not stop us from passing it in the House next week, and you will not stop us there. If the filibuster obstructs us, we will abolish it. If the Supreme Court objects, we will expand it, and we will not rest until we have taken weapons of war out of circulation in our communities. Each and every day, we will do whatever it takes to end gun violence, whatever it takes. What we will do is not fail the children of this country the way that you have failed us, the generations of Columbine, Sandy Hook, Parkland, and Uvalde. I yield back, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back for our purposes. The gentleman from Ohio seek recognition.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now we know. Now we know where they want to go. We just said it. End the filibuster, expand the court, forget the Constitution. Now we know. Democrats blame guns. They criticize the NRA. They call Republicans names. But let's be honest. They've told us what they want to do. Their real beef is with the Second Amendment. Their real beef is with the Second Amendment. Think about what this bill does. Mr. Massey just outlined the 6 bills thrown into one. What this bill does, it tells law-abiding citizens when you can get a gun, what kind of gun you can get, what accessories you can get for your gun, and where and how you have to store it in your own darn home. That's what this bill does. This is an assault. This is the start. This is the start. We know it's the start because Ms. Jackson Lee, the first person to speak on their side, said this: we're not finished. This is just the beginning. Their goal, plain and simple, is to get rid of the Second Amendment. Joe Biden said it the other day. He said he wants to ban 9mm handguns. Michael Moore said it last week. Time to repeal the Second Amendment, he said. We know where the Democrats want to go, and they don't care about the Constitution. Mr. Bishop pointed that out just a few minutes ago. They know the age limit in this bill is unconstitutional. We just had a decision last month from the most liberal circuit in the country. Said it's unconstitutional. They know the storage provisions are unconstitutional. The Heller decision said so. They don't care. Forget the Constitution. They want to change the country in so many dramatic ways. The gentleman from New York just talked about getting rid of the filibuster, packing the court. We know they want to pack the court because the chairman of this committee introduced a bill 14 months ago to pack the court. And the worst of it is, this bill would not address the tragedies we have seen unfold around the country in the last couple weeks. Would not stop the terrible events that we saw. Wouldn't harden schools. In fact, the spokesperson for the president just said last week, hardening schools is not something President Biden wants to happen, not something he believes in. I find that astonishing, but that's what she said. This bill would not stop the terrible events, it wouldn't harden schools, but it will sure take away the rights of the American people who follow the law. That's what this is all about. And it's just so wrong. But it is part of the pattern we have seen. And again, as Mr. Bishop pointed out a few minutes ago, this is the Judiciary Committee. You would think there would be the proper respect for the Constitution and for decisions reached by our circuit courts. Nope. We are so focused on taking away people's liberty. It's frightening to me when you put it all in context and you think about what the Democrats are trying to do to First Amendment liberties, now to Second Amendment liberties. This is what frightens the American people, and that's why we should vote this bill down, and we should come together as a bipartisan in a bipartisan way to figure out what we can do to help make schools safe, make sure that people are properly trained there, make sure the facility is the way it needs to be. We're all for that, But we're not for taking away this. We're not for taking away Second Amendment liberties, not for ending the Second Amendment like they want to do. Mr. Chairman, I would yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
I thank the ranking member. Quote, "We must dismantle white supremacy in all aspects of our society, and that means moving funding away from police departments and toward programs that improve public safety by helping to address the roots of systemic inequality." The gentleman from New York, the gentleman who just told us who he is, and I believe him. Except what the gentleman from New York described is annihilating the Second Amendment without repealing it in the manner contemplated by the Constitution of the United States.
Would the gentleman yield?
Understand what we are up against, because he just
Would the
told
gentleman
us.
yield?
He just told us,
Will the gentleman from
and
Ohio
I believe
yield?
him. I yield back to the gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
I wasn't aware that Michael Moore was a Democratic member of the House. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, we originally called this markup to make a vow to the families of the 21 people, including 19 children and 2 teachers who were murdered last week in the 27th school shooting this year. A vow to the families of the 10 people killed in a supermarket by an 18-year-old gunman in Buffalo, New York, just 2 weeks before Uvalde, Texas. A vow to the families of so many mass shootings who have channeled their anger and their grief into pushing for action from Congress to take life-saving measures by passing legislation for common sense, necessary, life-saving gun reforms through the House of Representatives, and demanding that the Senate act to stop the insanity of mass shootings that plagues our country. And yet, before we could even have this hearing today, before the funerals have been held for those who died in Uvalde, just last night, America experienced another mass shooting at the St. Francis Medical Building in Tulsa, Oklahoma. At least 4 people died, people who themselves were working to save lives, people who were parents who left behind children, people who should be alive today. Reports from the scene detail the shooter carrying 2 guns, one an AR-style semi-automatic rifle, like the one used in the Uvalde massacre, but just yesterday, carrying those 2 guns through the medical buildings before the shooting began. And because of Oklahoma's open carry law, hospital personnel were unable to do anything before the shooter began his rampage. And while we don't know the details, let me remind you that Republicans, in their never-ending pursuit to increase the number of guns on our streets and in our schools, passed laws in Oklahoma so that no permit is needed to purchase a firearm from a private individual, no waiting period is required to purchase a firearm, and no firearm registration is required in the state. In Oklahoma, anyone over the age of 21 can openly carry a firearm, including an AR-15, without a license or registration. Weapons that can cause mass devastation are subject to less common sense safety measures than cars or motorcycles. The children of Uvalde are all of our children. The parents in Buffalo and Oklahoma are all of our parents. This is our responsibility, and it doesn't have to be this way. Today, we have a chance to say no more, to refuse to allow our schools and our supermarkets, our hospitals and our theaters, our public places turned into war zones where children hide terrified under desks or in closets, or doctors in medical facilities don't know if they are going to save a life or have their own taken away. Do not tell me that the answer to this is to put even more guns on the streets or to militarize our schools or our theaters or our hospitals with metal detectors and cops. Do not talk about taking away fundamental freedoms when what we are doing by refusing to pass sensible reforms is taking away the fundamental freedom for children to go to school and play and live. And don't tell me that the answer to this is just about mental health. We certainly have mental health challenges that we have to respond to, but countries around the world have similar mental health challenges, but no other modern wealthy country has these mass shootings as we do. What sets us apart, sadly, is the enormous number of guns and lack of regulation around guns, and most importantly, the lack of political will from Republicans to respond to these mass shootings. When other countries have had a major mass shooting, they have responded and it has worked. In March of 1996, Great Britain experienced the deadliest mass shooting in its history at an elementary school. The shooter murdered 16 children and their teacher and injured 15 others. And in response, the British Parliament banned high caliber pistols. Since then, there has been not a single shooting in the UK. 6 weeks later, the deadliest single person mass shooting in Australia and the third worst in the world occurred in Tasmania, killing 35 people and wounding 23. Australia passed sweeping reforms, including banning nearly all semi-automatic rifles and shotguns and launching a program to buy back over 600,000 firearms. And since then, there has been only one mass shooting in Australia. Other countries have responded to gun violence with decisive action that effectively wiped away mass shootings. And meanwhile, the United States makes up 4% of the global population, but close to 15% of firearm deaths worldwide. So do not tell me that we don't know what works. We know what works. We know that what we need to do is to pass this bill and say yes to saving lives for our children and our families. Let's do what is right.
Does the gentlelady yield back?
I do.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Stubbe seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
In the filibuster, expand the court, take away your constitutional rights under the Second Amendment. Well, we just heard that that's exactly what the Democrats want to do here today and in the House in this coming week. On Monday, Biden stated a 9mm bullet blows the lung out of the body, and I quote, "So the idea of these high caliber weapons is there's simply no rational basis for it in terms of thinking about self-protection." So you can't protect yourself with a 9mm. I guess according to Biden, only a 22 round ammunition would be sufficient. Then the White House walked back that statement and said he supports a ban on the sale of assault weapons, which there's no such thing, and high capacity magazines. High capacity magazines. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Yesterday, Speaker Pelosi, speaking at an anti-gun rally in San Francisco, stated, "We will have a hearing markup on an assault weapon ban. Their plans and their intentions are clear. They want to take away law-abiding citizens' ability to purchase the firearm of their choice, and don't let them fool you that they are not attempting to take away your ability to purchase handguns. They're using the magazine ban to do it. Last year in 2021, the Glock 19 was the highest sold handgun in the United States. It comes with a 15-round magazine. That gun would be banned. Right here in front of me, I have a Sig Sauer P226. Comes with a 21-round magazine. This gun would be banned. Here's a 12-round magazine. This magazine would be banned under this current bill. It doesn't fit because this gun was made for a 20-round, 21-round magazine. This gun would be banned under this bill. Here's a Sig Sauer 320. It takes a 20-round magazine. Here's a 12-round magazine that would be banned. It doesn't fit because it would be banned. This gun would be banned under this bill. Here's a gun I carry every single day to protect myself, my family, my wife, my home. This is a XL Sig Sauer P365. Comes with a 15-round magazine. Here's a 7-round magazine, which would be less than what would be lawful under this bill if this bill were to become law. It doesn't fit. So this gun would be banned.
I hope the gun is not loaded.
I'm at my house. I can do whatever I want with my guns.
Here's a point of order.
Is exactly what the Democrats want to do. Now let's just take the policy objectives that they're trying to accomplish and look at the municipalities that have actually passed it. Maryland, Washington, D.C., Cook County, Illinois, all have some of the strictest gun country laws in the country, including limiting magazines to only 10 rounds. By comparison, in Florida, there are significantly less restrictions and no limits on magazine size in the state of Florida.
Would the gentleman yield for a
Are
question?
these laws effective?
Would the
Let's
gentleman
look at the
yield for a
homicide
question?
rates in major cities and anti-gun jurisdictions that have magazine bans.
Would the gentleman
and
yield
compare
for a
them to
question?
the state of Florida, where we have freedom and the ability to carry whatever firearm we want.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Largest city by area in the state, in my state.
Would the gentleman yield for a question? Yes or no?
No, I'm trying to get my point across in the 2
The
minutes
answer
that
is
I
no.
have left.
Gentleman won't yield.
The murder rate was more, now let me start back over, and I hope you give me my 10 or 15 seconds back that you just took. Jacksonville, Florida, the largest city by area in my state, the murder rate was more than half of DC or Chicago in 2021, and you are 4 times lower, and it was 4 times lower than in Baltimore, Maryland. All jurisdictions that have a magazine ban, you're safer in the state of Florida where we don't have it. If you live in Tampa, Florida, near my district, or in Orange County, where Orlando is located, in 2021, you were roughly 3 times less likely to be murdered here in Florida, in Orange County, or in Tampa than in Chicago or DC, where they both have magazine bans. And you are a whopping 5 times less likely to be murdered than in Baltimore, Maryland, than in Tampa, Florida, or Orange County. Additionally, the state of West Virginia is instructive on this point. West Virginia has some of the most gun-friendly laws in the country, including permitless carry, no magazine restrictions. For purposes of comparing apples to apples, West Virginia also faces some struggles and has poverty levels comparable to nearby Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Yet someone is 9 times less likely to be murdered in West Virginia than in Baltimore, and approximately 5 times less than in D.C., according to the most recent numbers in those jurisdictions. These anti-gun cities, particularly ones with magazine bans, have some of the highest crime rates in the country, and they are growing worse. These laws do nothing to stop crime, and no one here thinks they will actually stop mass shootings. This is a push to take away your right to carry whatever firearm you please to defend yourself. So I hope our colleagues in the Senate are paying attention. A magazine ban will not allow you to carry these type of handguns because they don't have the capacity to take such a small magazine. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just returned from traveling to visit with other governments in Europe who have been receiving Ukrainian refugees, who have been standing up to Russia. It was an important series of meetings, but every single meeting started with expressions of sympathy and condolences and questions about how it is that the United States continues to have this horrific gun violence problem. I thought it would be important just to respond to some of what we've heard and to make clear what we're actually doing here. First of all, to the ranking member and to Mr. Bishop, I so resent being told that I don't care about the Constitution. We all do, and you know it's not true. Yes, there's a Ninth Circuit decision. There are also other circuits who have come down the other way. And when you refer to Heller, I think it's important to point out the words of Justice Scalia in the Heller decision when he said, like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited, who then went on to explain exactly how. So let's at least be clear that what's happening here, first of all, is constitutional. Now let's talk about what we're trying to do. We already passed legislation to require a check of one's background to make sure you don't have a violent history. There's nobody who's watching this who thinks that if you have a violent history, you should be able to buy a firearm. That's just straightforward. That's what we already passed, and that's what the Senate needs to bring up and pass. And look at what's in this bill. Raise the age for purchasing a semi-automatic rifle from 18 to 21. Let's also acknowledge that in America, you can't buy a handgun unless you're 21. That somehow hasn't been brought up today. By the way, you also can't buy a drink and you can't buy tobacco unless you're 21 either, but you can go in and you can buy a semi-automatic assault rifle, which, by the way, for every time someone sits in this meeting and says, well, nothing we're doing here would have prevented this. Well, actually, if we had a law that said you have to be 21 to buy, then these 2 AR-15s would not have been purchased. So that's what the 18 to 21 is. Also, Florida, my own Florida, raised the age to buy a gun to 21. It's a really important step that we can take. Also, we'll be voting, before I get back to this, we'll be voting on red flag laws, which Florida passed, which have now been used 5,800 times to make sure that people with violent histories don't do harm to themselves or to others. Florida did that. We want federal offenses for gun trafficking and straw purchases because we don't want people to feel that they're able to simply bring guns to cities that don't have restrictions, don't buy them where they don't have restrictions, take them to other cities. We're tough on crime in this committee, right? We all ought to be supportive of cracking down on gun traffickers who put people's lives at risk. Safe storage of firearms. Look, if you have a child in your house, my guess is for every one of my colleagues on this committee who owns a firearm, you store it safely. But shouldn't everyone, if they have a child in their house, have to store their firearm safely? That's what this bill does. Bump stocks. Let's remember what bump stocks are. Bump stocks in Las Vegas allowed the shooter to fire off his gun as to do it more rapidly, to do it almost as a fully automatic rifle. Well, President Trump wanted to get rid of those. We're getting rid of them here. Everybody ought to be supportive of that. And then finally, on high capacity magazines, all we're doing is limiting the capacity. And we're not banning guns. We're not taking anyone's guns away. We're not taking anyone's magazine away either. We're limiting it. And you know why? Because when a shooter goes into a school and has to reload, or goes anyplace else where there are mass shootings, which is everywhere, and has to reload, it provides an opportunity for someone to stop him and stop the killing. That's what that's about. And I'll finish with this. Look, I completely agree. We ought to be working together on school safety issues. We ought to pass the Luke and Alex School Safety Act. We ought to pass the Eagles Act. But this isn't just about schools. This is about these horrific mass shootings that happen everywhere. We ought to pass Jamie's law that my constituent, Fred Guttenberg, who lost his daughter, Jamie, has worked so hard on to require background checks on ammo. There's a lot that we can do. And finally, when Governor Abbott says that there's a problem getting access to mental health care, we should surge mental health care professionals into every underserved community in our country. You should all work with us. Everyone should work to get that done. This is a reasonable piece of legislation that will help to save lives. It's important that we do it. We owe it to every family who continues to suffer, as so many in my community continue to. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your bringing this bill forward for markup, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes Ms. Deming seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. My colleague from North Carolina had the audacity to talk about bullies. Well, I think bullies showed up on January 6th and trampled all over the United States Constitution. I think bullies are trying to take away a woman's right to choose. I think bullies all over this country are involved in gerrymandering and trying to suppress the right to vote. So if we want to talk about bullies, let's talk about those things. You know, it has been very interesting listening to this discussion. As a former police chief, a former crisis negotiator, the commander of the critical incident management team, I hardly know how to describe or begin to understand why people who have the power and the opportunity to do good, to make a difference, just simply refuse to do so, come hell or high water. And Lord knows we have seen hell come over and over again, whether it was Columbine, Sandy Hook, Virginia Tech, Las Vegas, El Paso, all our churches, Mother Emanuel, Sutherland Springs, in our movie theaters, our synagogues, grocery stores, the Pulse nightclub that just happens to be in my district, Parkland, Uvalde. And as my colleague said, before we can even get this hearing started today, a hospital in Oklahoma. Now, we all know that law enforcement is expected to do something to respond quickly and enforce the laws. Well, guess what? We as members of Congress are responsible for writing those laws, and we have watched hell come time and time again, over and over again, and simply have failed the American people. Well, I don't know about my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, but I am certainly not proud of that. Mr. Chairman, is there anyone really on this committee? Because sometimes it's hard to tell, is there really one who really believes that it's okay for an 18-year-old to purchase an assault weapon or an assault style weapon that can do unimaginable damage to the human body and also be able to purchase thousands of rounds of ammunition? Is there anyone on this committee who really believes that that is okay? The Ammunition Background Check Act, known as Jamie's Law, which my colleague Mr. Dorich just mentioned. Jamie was a young woman with her whole future ahead of us who lost her life at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Mr. Chairman, I ask my colleagues to not wait another day. And let's just sit back and see who's going to be killed next. Who's going to die next in a mass shooting. Just as we expect law enforcement to do something, well, with our power comes responsibility too. The American people are expecting us to do something. Let's don't sit back and wait for the next child in this country to die in their classroom. Mr. Chairman, I believe that there is no country with a greater ability to protect our children than the United States. And there's been several people talking about Florida, talking about Parkland and laws that Florida passed. Well, let me be clear about this. It was the Republican-led legislation who thought that children dying at Parkland was ridiculous and shameful and appalling. And it was that legislation that raised the age, that legislation that imposed a 3-day waiting period, and that legislation or legislators that passed red flag laws. Somehow, through all of the politics that we see played today, they remembered, as we talk about constitutional rights, they remembered the rights of our children not to die by gunfire in the classroom. But you know what? They don't spend all of their time in the classroom. They go to church, they go to the balls, they go to the movie theater. We will be held accountable for acts of omission and commission. May heaven help us. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose is Mr. Buck seek recognition?
Right, the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it is terribly sad what's happened in this country in the last few weeks and in the last few years, frankly. I was a federal prosecutor when Columbine happened and was part of a group that went into the school the day after. And what I saw was terrible. I had young children in school, and it impacted me and those with me and frankly, all of America. Living in Colorado, I've also experienced the Aurora school shooting, or I'm sorry, the Aurora theater shooting up close. And certainly recently the Boulder grocery store shooting. But one thing I've learned from law enforcement and one thing I've learned from being involved in these particular shootings and also observing what's happening in our country, these laws will not help the situation. And frankly, I will vote against the bill that has been proposed. It is a problem when we tell the American people that we have solutions, and we don't have easy solutions for what's happening right now. We need to hold hearings. We need to examine the underlying causes. There are some ideas that I think would be helpful in terms of hardening schools and some other ideas. Gun-free school zones have been a failure. Gun-free zones have been a failure. The Aurora theater shooting, there were a dozen premieres of the Batman movie the night of the Aurora theater shooting. within a few miles of where that shooting occurred. That shooting occurred in a gun-free zone, and the other premiers were not in gun-free zones. Did the shooter take that into account? I don't know. But it's clear that disarming Americans is not a way to reduce gun violence. We've seen assault weapons bans. The assault weapon ban that was in place, the federal assault weapon ban that was in place for 10 years, we saw a violent gun crime increase during that time. It did not reduce violent gun crime in America. These bills that have been presented, the Safe Storage Act, Ethan's Law, Safe Guns, Safe Kids Act, Closing the Bump Stock, Keep Americans Safe Act, would not have prevented what happened in the last 3 shootings and many other shootings. We have a serious problem involving family, involving drugs, involving mental health in this country. We have gone the wrong direction in the last 40 or 50 years. We have become a less safe society. Generally, blaming the gun for what's happening in America is small-minded. It is unfortunate that we can't come together as a group of well-thought-through legislators that want to deal with this problem, pointing the fingers at each other and saying, well, you're only doing this because you're trying to gain political points on the heels of a dangerous shooting, and then for you to tell us that well, we're controlled by the NRA. I voted against the NRA. I'll vote against the NRA when I think they're wrong. I'm representing my constituents. In rural Colorado, an AR-15 is a gun of choice for killing raccoons before they get to our chickens. It is a gun of choice for killing a fox. It is a gun that you control predators on your ranch, on your farm, on your property. The idea that somehow we're going to deny access to, I think there are 20 million AR-15s in circulation in this country. It makes absolutely no sense, and it's unfortunate. I think that there are other answers. We've certainly in Colorado, we have discussed the possibility of incentivizing veterans who come back from the military or discharged from the military to go into education and teach and be able to carry guns in a school as a teacher, as an administrator, as a coach, trying to help to strengthen our system. I think we've got to get beyond the finger pointing at this point. I think we've got to get to the point where we're holding hearings, and I hope when Republicans take the majority in November, that in January, we will start to hold hearings and come up with answers that are meaningful, not answers where we tell the American public we've solved the problem. We're going to make sure that there's no guns in schools, so law-abiding citizens don't have guns in schools, but criminals do. We want to make sure that we get to the bottom line of a very complex and very serious problem that this country faces. And I hope we do in the future. It's obvious to me that right now that's not what's intended, and it's sad. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes? The gentleman from California seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
19 kids are dead. 19 children are dead. And so to my Republican colleagues, I ask, who are you here for? Are you here for our kids, or are you here for the killers? Because if you were here for the kids, you would do all you could to protect the next school shooting that's about to happen. And we know what's going to happen in America. You would vote to raise the age on purchasing an assault rifle. You would vote to ban high-capacity magazines. You would vote to require safe storage. And you would vote to address ghost guns, which are ravaging communities across America. But if you're here for the killers, you would do everything to make it easier for the next school shooting to happen. And Mr. Jordan, to say we are trying to dramatically change the country, if trying to make sure that no more kids are put in the ground with a Superman coffin means dramatically change the country, guilty. That's why we're here. Kids are going in the ground today, and you call that trying to dramatically change the country. Why aren't you trying to dramatically change the number of dead kids going into the ground, Mr. Jordan? Who are you here for, the kids or the killers? My Republican colleagues are here for carnival games. They say it's about mental health. Okay, we try and fund mental health, they vote against it. They say it's about schools. We try and fund the schools, fund the teachers. They vote against it. They say it's about policing. $300 million in the American Rescue Plan for community policing. They all voted against it. And they don't want to listen to the police. If they listen to the police, they'd listen to the major cities' chiefs who have called for background checks, red flag laws, banning bump stocks, and banning high-capacity magazines. My favorite, it's about the family. We need to address the family issues in America. But we don't want to help feed a family. We're going to make it harder for kids to live on food stamps. We don't want to help a family learn. We're going to go after teachers in America. We don't want to help kids go to college. We don't want to give them jobs. We're going to vote against the infrastructure and jobs bill. And then they say that laws don't work. But they have no problem crafting laws to take away a woman's right to make her own healthcare decision. That law must work. They have no problem going after laws to ban drugs. There's plenty of laws on the books to ban drugs, but no, it's all about the person. Laws don't work when you have evil in our country. That's what they tell us. And then they tell us that we're in a country where you have violent video games, mental health problems, schools that can't be secured, and too many gun-free zones. And their solution to that is to put more of the most dangerous weapons into that mix. That's insane. They're also out of touch with the overwhelming majority of gun owners in America. An organization called 97% just put out a poll that said among gun owners, and they only polled gun owners, 86% support background checks, 76% support safe storage, 67% support red flag laws. Those are gun owners. So who are you here for? Our kids or the killers? I'm here for people like Alex Navarro. She's a Moms Demand Action leader in the San Francisco Bay Area. And last week, after I convened a meeting among my constituents and people like Fred Guttenberg and Dr. Joe Saccharin, an emergency room physician at Johns Hopkins, Alex Navarro told my constituents that her 6-year-old daughter, after Uvalde, after seeing the images behind me, said to her, "Mom, what picture are you going to use for me? What picture are you going to use for me?" That's what children are asking their parents across America because they don't believe they're going to come out alive. What picture are you going to use for me? We're supposed to be the protectors. We're supposed to be here for the kids. And so to my colleagues today who flew in town, came to work, got ready to argue, my question is, why did you come here at all? Why did you come here at all? If you're not here for the children, why don't you go to the funeral of the killer? Because that's the only place where the killer is being celebrated. We're here to get things done and protect our kids. What's your job? I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes, Mr. Gorman seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think that it's very effective for the children to have people on the other side of the aisle come in and accuse Republicans of being complicit in murder, and that we put our right to kill over others' right to live, to infer by rhetorical supposed questions, who are you here for? We must. How dare you? You think we don't have hearts? It's just that when we look at the things that you're doing and you're trying to do to America, we've seen the carnage. I mean, for heaven's sake, let's take example. Democrats control the major cities that have the worst murder rates. That's right. Your ideas have been shown to get people killed. Are you here for the murderers in Chicago in Philadelphia, in these other major cities, because you're wanting to do nationally what is being done by Democrats in those big cities. We care about people. We care about their lives. And lives have been so trivialized. We care deeply. How dare you? How dare you, you arrogant people, attributing murder to those of us that want to do things to stop it? Because we've seen what your ideas do. They create more murder. Okay, let's look. Rochester, New York. These are cities that set the all-time high homicide rates in 2021. This is what you're shooting for, apparently, figuratively speaking. Rochester, New York, they had a record homicide rate of 80, not that big of a city. Philadelphia, 524 last year. And by the way, all of these are Democrat mayors. Louisville, Kentucky hit a high homicide rate. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Austin, Texas, Indianapolis, St. Paul, Portland, Albuquerque, Tucson, Columbus, Jackson, Mississippi, Atlanta, New Haven. Those are all Democrat ideas they control. They've done so many of the things that Democrats in this committee want to do. We're not alleging you don't care. We're just telling you that your ideas have gotten people killed, not saved lives, for heaven's sake. And then you want to be arrogant and accuse us of murder and of not, we care. And if you could just possibly get off any kind of arrogant stepladder that allows you to look down on us and look back historically. Thomas Jefferson was not at the Constitutional Convention, but he said in a letter, if I could change one thing, it would be to require bills to be on file for a year before they're voted on, because he understood the mistakes that are made when you rush and make big decisions out of emotion. That's what we're trying to prevent so that we can save lives and keep people from being killed. For heaven's sake, I think back historically, we had a president in Franklin Roosevelt that on D-Day led the country in a 6 to 8 minute prayer for our troops. And now we had a president come on after Uvalde and he used God's name in vain. Most of us would consider it. It was used as an interjection, not as a source from whom to beg for wisdom, like this country did for most of our history. Since the 60s, we really started having these mass shootings. Perhaps there was something in the 60s, maybe some Supreme Court decisions that gave rise to people being taught in school. It's whatever you think feels good. Well, it's time to get common sense back and to look historically about where people are being murdered in record rates, and don't repeat that like the Democrats are trying to do. Let's do common sense things that will save lives. I'm out of time, so you'll back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes Ms. Scanlon seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I do want to respond first to Mr. Gomer, and I'm sorry that he and many of his colleagues didn't think it was important enough to be here today. But I did want to respond to his allegation that Philadelphia's homicide rate
the gentlelady
is
yield
no, I will
so
not.
I can explain
I will
why
not
I
yield.
couldn't get there. My
The gentlelady does not
Time
yield.
is mine.
The gentlelady does not yield. The time is hers.
I waited for
I wanted to
hours.
Gentlelady
respond.
does not yield.
I wanted to respond to Mr. Gomert's allegation that Philadelphia's homicide rate is the fault of Democratic leadership in that city. Apparently, he doesn't understand that the Commonwealth's Republican legislature for decades has blocked city leadership from passing the types of common sense gun safety laws we are considering today. So to the broader question, like most Americans, I am sickened and sick to death of the gun carnage we experience in this country every single day. I will not sit idly by watching preventable tragedies play out over and over again, day after day, year after year. Whether the children and teachers slaughtered in Texas last week, the community members murdered in Tulsa last night, or Buffalo the week before, or the more than a dozen people gunned down in Philadelphia during the Memorial Day weekend. In cities and towns across the country, we are mourning too many people whose lives have been cut short, including children whose lives had barely begun. We are not helpless here. We can change this. We can pass gun violence prevention laws that are constitutional and save lives. All it takes is political courage, a willingness to put Americans' lives above gun maker profits. Over 2 decades ago, after the Columbine shooting, I rejected helplessness and hopelessness to organize members of my community to join the Million Mom March here in DC. Since then, I've supported groups like Moms Demand Action for Gun Safety and Ceasefire PA, and candidates who are willing to advocate for gun safety laws. And in 2018, I came to Congress along with many of my colleagues, sent here by our constituents to pass common sense gun violence prevention legislation. And I'm not alone. The majority of my constituents and fellow Americans have decided enough is enough as well. They are demanding action from federal and state lawmakers. Gun violence is a big, multifaceted problem, but doing nothing is not a solution. The profits of gun manufacturers cannot be worth more than the lives of our children, our neighbors, our teachers, our doctors, our seniors. The Protecting Our Kids Act will address some of the key enabling conditions for gun violence and make changes that are constitutional, that will make America safer, and that are supported by law enforcement. This is not about repealing the Second Amendment or taking away the guns of responsible gun owners. I want to echo Mr. Deutsch in reminding our colleagues of Justice Scalia's opinion in Heller, in which he said that, like the other rights secured by the Bill of Rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not without limits. Or as other justices have noted, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. This bill before us is not about being pro-gun or anti-gun. It's about desperately needing to stop gun violence. To my colleagues who oppose each and every common sense gun safety measure, do not insult Americans, our children, our teachers, or the memory of all those we have lost by offering thoughts and prayers with no action. Year after year, decade after decade, as the Bible tells us, faith without works is dead, and we are here to work. Do not insult Americans by offering hollow solutions like turning schools into armed fortresses when you won't spend the money to remove asbestos or lead from those schools. Do not insult Americans by advocating to arm teachers and guidance counselors and librarians when many of our schools don't have enough money to hire guidance counselors or librarians or enough teachers. And do not insult Americans by saying that fortifying schools is the solution when our children and the rest of us have to face the prospect of gunfire on the way to or from school and work, or the supermarket, or the hospital, or the movie theater, or our churches, mosques, and synagogues. I refuse to tell our children there's nothing we can do, that they must be sacrificial lambs to a twisted theory of armed Second Amendment liberty that is decoupled from personal responsibility. Our children know as well as we do that something can be done. We know it in our guts. Our children deserve to learn and grow in safety, and we have the power to give our kids a more hopeful and bright future. This weekend, America's National Youth Poet Laureate, Amanda Gorman, offered us a hymn in which she says, "May we choose our children over chaos. May another innocent never be lost." Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Johnson of Louisiana seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard some really outrageous and even very revealing things today. Mr. Jones said several minutes ago that we Democrats are seeking to abolish the filibuster and expand and pack the Supreme Court. We'll do anything necessary, he said, and that's what we know this is about. On Monday, President Joe Biden looked into a camera and said that he wants to ban 9mm handguns. This is one of the most widely purchased and used handguns by the citizens, law-abiding citizens of this country. In 2018, retired liberal Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens called for the repeal of the Second Amendment. And in recent days, liberals in Hollywood and even on Capitol Hill have started to echo that drumbeat once again. Our colleagues have made some outrageous claims here in this hearing today, been listening since it started. They claim, for example, that raising the purchasing age for semi-automatic rifles and shotguns to 21 will reduce school shootings. But as has been noted, this action has already been ruled unconstitutional by the liberal U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, no less, when they struck down a California law imposing similar restrictions on gun purchases for 18 to 20-year-olds.
Would the gentleman yield
Today,
for a moment?
I will not yield. Today, they've claimed that Republicans don't care about gun violence. We've heard this breathlessly over and over and over, and that's just outrageous. House Republicans have worked tirelessly to combat gun violence and have enacted meaningful laws to put more resources into mental health, to provide training for guidance counselors, to fund grants for law enforcement, while the other side was trying to defund it, and provide money to harden schools. As has been noted today, President Biden apparently is not in favor of that idea. And that just seems crazy to anyone who looks at it objectively. Today, Democrats have claimed that gun-free school zones promote school safety, but arming teachers and school administrators would mean well-trained adults would be at the ready to protect themselves and the innocent children in their care. The depraved shooter in Buffalo a few weeks ago wrote in his manifesto, quote, "Areas where carrying a concealed weapon or outlawed or prohibited may be good areas of attack." Yeah, obviously. And of course, tragically, the elementary school in Uvalde banned people from carrying firearms. Yesterday, I interviewed for my podcast, Pastor YJ Jimenez. He's a pastor there on the ground who is ministering to the people of that West Texas community who have suffered from such unspeakable loss. His calming presence and clear conviction in national interviews has captured the attention of millions of Americans because he has spoken to the root causes for all this modern violence and bloodshed. America has a heart problem, he said, and he's exactly right. As Mr. Buck noted a few moments ago, what we're seeing right now is the results of decades of decline with the secularization of American society, the open assault on religion and morality and absolutes, and the breakdown of law and order. We're seeing the results of all this on young people in clinical settings, in the culture at large, and of course in our schools. And it's an inevitable result of decisions that we've made in this culture. Yesterday, a New York Times survey was published that found that 94% of school administrators today say that students are suffering from anxiety and depression, and 88% report that students are having trouble managing their emotions. You know, Thoreau said there are thousands hacking at the branches of evil, the one who is striking at the root. This hearing today was called for this hastily pulled together hodgepodge of Democrat bills that have been sitting on the shelf and will do nothing to solve the real problems at hand. This is hacking at branches for the simple purpose of making a show, while the root problems remain unaddressed. That's what we should be working on. That's what we intend to work on. That's what we will work on when the Republicans retake the majority. We'll address the root causes. I hope we can. God help us to do that. I'd like to yield my remaining time to Mr. Gomer if he desires that, to address the false claim that was just made about him. Mr. Gobert, are you still with us?
Yes, I am, and I appreciate my friend from Louisiana. I waited for hours at the DFW airport, but there were problems with the flight. That's why I'm not in D.C. But just like we've heard on so many other allegations, they're without basis, without knowledge. But one thing we've learned repeatedly, when Democrats accuse Republicans of things, whether it's colluding with Russia, it's often gaslighting and tells us more about what's in the conscience of the accusers. And I would also remind my colleagues, I didn't know in 2016, but when the Democrats took the House floor, they obstructed an official session of Congress, which is a felony. And that's what many of January 6ers were charged with. I yield back.
Yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back for what purposes. Gentleman from Colorado seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be remiss if I didn't respond, at least briefly, to my colleague, Mr. Johnson. We have extended debates from time to time on the Constitution and our competing views about the constitutionality of different provisions, but I have to confess that I have seen Republicans do something today that I never thought I would ever see, which is apparently praising the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and taking the position that a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision is the final word on the constitutionality of a given provision. Of course, I've served on this committee long enough to remember my colleagues on the other side of the aisle complaining about the Ninth Circuit year after year after year and making the case that simply because the Ninth Circuit had ruled something unconstitutional did not mean as a dispositive matter that the statute in question was unconstitutional. But in any event, I will digress. Mr. Chairman, I want to say—
Would the gentleman yield for a
you
moment?
I'll yield to the chairman, of course.
Yes, I simply want to point out that the so-called liberal Ninth Circuit that made that decision, the panel was composed of 2 Trump appointees who decided on the majority and 1 Clinton appointee in the minority, and other circuits have decided to the contrary. So talk about this so-called liberal Ninth Circuit is historical, but no longer the case. I yield back to the gentleman.
I thank the chairman. I agree. I think the chairman makes a salient point. And again, apparently the new standard for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle is that a singular panel decision from the Ninth Circuit is the final word on the constitutionality of a given state statute. Notwithstanding the potential en banc consideration to follow or potentially an appeal to the Supreme Court. In any event, I want to say thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this critically important emergency hearing. Our hearts are broken for the children of Uvalde, Texas. They are broken for the people of Buffalo, New York, and they are broken for the countless Americans that are being murdered each and every day in our country. Mr. Chairman, as you well know, the level of gun violence in our country is not normal, and we cannot stand for it. It is time, long past time, for this Congress to finally act and to start saving lives. My home state of Colorado has experienced the pain and the tragedy of gun violence far too often. In 1999, I was 14 years old when my high school was put on lockdown because 10 miles away, 2 shooters had entered Columbine High School and murdered in cold blood 13 innocent teachers and students. From Columbine to a movie theater in Aurora to the STEM school in Highlands Ranch, and as was mentioned previously, to a grocery store in my community last year, where 10 innocent people were murdered at a grocery store in Boulder, Colorado. Countless lives lost, children, parents, Coloradans, and Americans. The high schoolers who experienced Columbine are now grown up, and yet 23 years later, our kids continue to face gunfire in the places where they are supposed to be safe. Columbine was once considered to be the deadliest shooting in United States history at the time, and that, as we all know, is no longer the case. From Sandy Hook to Uvalde, far too many communities have been plagued by the scourge of gun violence. As policymakers, we have the opportunity today to do our part in stopping this violence. We have got to do more. We have to act. And today, we are doing precisely that. The Protecting Our Kids Act makes common sense changes to our gun laws that'll save lives. The safe storage requirements, which we passed in Colorado last year, raising the age required to buy semi-automatic rifles from 18 to 21, another common sense measure that I've co-sponsored since I came to Congress. There is more that we can and we must do, and I will certainly keep pushing for the same every day, because Boulder can't wait any longer. Colorado can't wait any longer, and our country certainly can't wait any longer. So I thank the chairman again for bringing this bill up for markup today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Shabbat seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7910, offered by Mr.
Chairman, I move that the amendment be considered as read.
I'll make that motion. The amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I mentioned in my opening statement, there are several ways in which I believe that we could work together to find some bipartisan solutions to this crisis, and this amendment is one of those possibilities. Following the shooting in Parkland, Florida, as I previously mentioned, former Sheriff Congressman John Rutherford led a bipartisan group of members, including myself, in reauthorizing and extending the Cops Secure Our Schools grant program. Mr. Chairman, I think somebody is unmuted out there that should mute.
Gentleman will proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That program provides necessary funds to states and local school districts to strengthen security measures at schools across the country. The money can be used for metal detectors, for example. It can be used to adopt security plans. It can be used to train school officials. It can be used to help to identify students who have mental health issues and get those students the treatments that they need, among other things. And oftentimes, teachers can be trained both on how to identify those students who may ultimately become dangerous with or without a weapon, or also how these particular incidents ought to be handled. You know, how doors can be locked and kept locked, and a whole range of other ways to make our schools safer. One of the additional items the grants could be used for is hiring school resource officers to help protect our schools. In particular, I think that we should be looking to hire retired police officers. And following Parkland, I met with the head of our local FOP here in Cincinnati, and that was his suggestion. And that was the reason that I had initially offered this and why I've been pushing for this since that time. And we'd like to see that expanded, not just retired police officers, but also honorably discharged military personnel. And they could also serve as resource officers where needed. I know for certain that there are at least a handful of school districts in my district in the greater Cincinnati area that either cannot find any school resource officers or cannot find as many as they'd like to hire because of lack of available personnel that have the necessary training. Obviously, I won't name those districts or those schools and expose any potential security vulnerabilities, but I'm sure that if this problem exists in Cincinnati, it exists in other parts of the country as well. Fortunately, we have a fairly expansive group of highly trained security experts readily available, and that's our retired police officers and honorably discharged military personnel. Placing highly trained and professional individuals in our schools is one of the easiest and safest methods to bolster school security. And no one is better trained and better equipped to handle potential school shootings than those folks, the police officers and military personnel. My amendment expresses the sense of Congress that more states and local school districts should consider employing retired officers and military personnel where it's appropriate as school resource officers. Hiring retired police officers and retired military personnel to provide school security is a common sense step to better secure our schools, and it could be achieved almost immediately. Most importantly, doing so could go a long way towards protecting our students who are in school to learn, not to become victims. Mr. Chairman, our nation's schools have become soft targets for any would-be killer who has gotten access to a gun. We even advertise with a sign that the murderer-to-be will be the only person on the scene with a gun. It's almost like a welcome mat. We need to do a better job of protecting both students and teachers and other personnel at our schools, because they're all vulnerable from those frequently and unfortunately increasingly frequent threats. Adopting this common sense amendment would be a significant step, I believe, in the right direction. And it's something we could do right now. And I think this is something that really would make a difference because hopefully we will be, if this passes and is part of the bill, members will read the bill. Members can reach out to school districts and schools in their own communities and make them aware that this money is available for them to harden the schools. That would actually accomplish something. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does the gentlelady insist on a point of order?
I withdraw my point of order.
The point of order is withdrawn. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. This amendment is based on the belief that the way to protect students is to have a good guy with a gun, as the Republicans often say, to stop the bad guy with a gun. But I believe that phrase was coined by the multi-million-dollar gun lobby's dealer, Wayne LaPierre, after a shooter killed 20 little children in Newtown, Connecticut. For the past 10 years, we've seen time and again that that concept has been proven wrong. A catchy saying designed to hide the truth, that Republicans refuse to help protect Americans from people we all agree should not be allowed to possess a weapon, as we're hearing today. In Uvalde, there were 7 good guys with guns, and they didn't feel they could go stop that bad guy. The gunman in Buffalo killed a good guy with a gun. We've tested that theory, and there's 31 dead people in these 2 attacks alone because we failed that test. Texas is filled with good guys with guns. Texas laws are so pro-gun lobby that companies need to swear they won't discriminate against the firearm industry. In Texas, there are over 8,600 federally regulated licensed firearm dealers, and according to RAND, 37% of Texan adults lived in a household with a firearm between 2007 and 2016. Again, Texas is filled with good guys with guns, but that couldn't save the lives of those 19 children and 2 teachers. It's time to try something new. Republicans are the same people who told us that more good guys with guns keep kids safe. Then they told us that armed officers in schools would keep kids safe. Then they told us more shooter drills would solve the problem. Then they told us again that armed officers in schools would solve the problem. Each time they've been proven wrong. Children have been murdered. How many children have to die before we stop taking them seriously? This amendment goes in the wrong direction, and I therefore oppose it. I yield back. Who seeks recognition? No one. For what purpose does Mr. Swalwell seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I understand the sentiment that Mr. Shabbat is bringing to this. I'm the son of a retired police officer. I have 2 brothers who are police officers, and our law enforcement family is just horrified by what happened at Uvalde. It's also unconscionable that police officers waited outside of a classroom as children were being slaughtered and 911 calls were being made from inside that classroom pleading for their lives. But what we have come to see across America is that our law enforcement are just outgunned. We're a country of unrestricted weaponry that continues to put the most dangerous weapons in the hands of the most dangerous people. So we could hire 100,000 retired police officers, but if we are a country that has over 100 million assault rifles, they're just outgunned. And that's what we saw in Uvalde. And tragically, in 2016, in Dallas, Texas, 5 brave police officers, SWAT-trained police officers, were murdered by a killer with an assault rifle. So I think we've debunked the idea that the answer to a killer with an assault rifle is to have more, quote unquote, good guys with guns. The good guys with guns are outgunned by the bad guys that we've given guns in our country. And so that's why we're addressing the root of the problem here with these 6 pieces of legislation. And with that, I'm going to yield to my colleague from Rhode Island, Mr. Sicily.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I'd just like to add a couple of thoughts. And the first is, I don't think there is a single incident, and maybe there's one, but I've not found one, of an assailant using an assault weapon that was stopped by a person with a gun. So this is maybe there's one of the thousands and thousands and thousands of shootings. But the truth of the matter is, school resource officers are an important response to school safety. I was a mayor of a city. We hired school resource officers. But what I also know is it requires special training to be a school resource officer, and it's up to local communities to decide where that's appropriate, what schools they want to use school resource officers in. And so having someone who's a retired police officer or someone who used to be in the Army may not actually be the best person to be in that position. And in addition to that, I think the COPS program that you reference here requires the hiring of police officers. And so I think we're urging the sense of Congress is actually to violate the requirements of the COPS program. So I don't think internally the amendment can work. the COPS program is specifically for police officers. I think there are good reasons that it be current police officers who are current training, who really understand what a school resource officer does. It's not about just plunking down a law enforcement person in a school. And I do think it creates the impression that that's the source of gun violence in schools. It's not. So I strongly support the chairman's position and oppose the amendment, and yield back to the gentleman from California.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Massey seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to speak on the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
Wow, the Democrats, I don't know if they're just in willful ignorance of what happens in this country or they're being deceptive today, but I would like to introduce into the record a list of cases where concealed handgun permit holders have likely stopped mass public shootings. This is from crimeresearch.org. It was published May 27th, 2022.
Without objection.
I'll read from this list, and I'm going to run out of time, but I'll try to make each of these summaries brief because there are dozens of instances. Even though the media doesn't want to report them, sometimes they get reported. Just this week, last week, May 25th, 2022, Charleston, West Virginia. Here, a man with an extensive criminal history started firing an AR-15 style firearm into a crowd. Fortunately, a woman who was legally carrying a gun was there to stop the attack. She shot the attacker. It ended before anybody got hurt. South Fulton, Georgia, May 3rd, 2022. A teenager started firing his gun at multiple people. There was a large number of people present at the park because of an anti-violence riot. South Fulton, Georgia, this comes from a news report. Meadows said, the men involved in the shootout with Hambrick have been cooperative and will likely not be charged since the teenager fired the first shot. After having reviewed most of the witnesses' statements, it appears that the descendant, Mr. Hambrick, discharged his weapon first, and as a result of that, there was an exchange of gunfire between him and two individuals, good guys with the gun. Portland, Oregon, February 19th, 2022. Homeowner allegedly confronted participants at a racial justice demonstration Saturday night before pulling out a handgun and shooting multiple people in the crowd, leaving one woman dead and several others injured. The shooting ended when a person with the group of demonstrators who is licensed to conceal carry a firearm fired back, striking the homeowner in the hip. Again, a good guy with a gun stops the shooting. Lancaster, Pennsylvania, October 17th, 2021. On Sunday, October 17th, 4 people were injured after a fight between two teenagers at Lancaster Park. City Center Mall escalated into a shooting this past weekend. A 16-year-old who was illegally carrying a gun started the shooting, but it could have been much worse were it not for concealed handgun permit holder. A bystander armed with a gun intervened in the shooting one of the participants. The unidentified bystander who legally possessed the firearm had heard gunshots related to the fight between two males that knew each other, police said. The bystander remained on the scene until security and police arrived. Syracuse, New York, August 31st, 2021. The district attorney credited a property manager with saving the lives of several individuals after he pulled out a legally possessed 9mm handgun, the very gun that Joe Biden wants to ban, and fatally wounded a man who opened fire on a crowd outside a building. San Antonio, Texas, August 11, 2021. A woman who crashed into a parked car in San Antonio's West Side neighborhood climbed out of her vehicle and began shooting indiscriminately at people who came out of their homes and rushed to aid her. The armed resident fired back and shot the driver to death, ending the violent threat to the neighborhood. And that was a good guy with a gun, or good gal with a gun sometimes. Fort Myers, Florida, July 22nd, 2021. A man who was a convicted felon and illegally possessing a gun fired multiple shots into a crowd before a bystander returned fire. When the bystander confronted the attacker, he stopped attacking and threw his gun in a parking lot. Fortunately, no one was injured in the attack. Chicago, Illinois, July 4th, 2021. It seems likely that if the concealed handgun permit holder hadn't intervened in this case, there would have been at least 3 deaths instead of just the one woman. Arvada, Colorado, June 21st, 2021. The attacker and 2 other people were killed in this attack. A good Samaritan who was killed in a shooting in Alvarado, Colorado. He did not hesitate. He didn't stand there and think about it. He totally heard the gunfire, went to the door, saw the shooter, and immediately ran in that direction. I just want to make sure his family knows how heroic he was. Tyrone said he witnessed Hurley confront the gunman. Mr. Hurley shot him. I think I heard 6 shots from his gun, maybe 5. Police chief said Hurley is a true hero who likely disrupted what could have been a larger loss of life. I'm running out of time, but Fort Smith, Arkansas, May 15th, 2021, Zachary Arnold, 26, fatally shot Lois Hicks, 87, in her apartment, then began shooting at other people in neighborhood apartments. Wallace A. West, 58, used a rifle, not a concealed handgun, to stop the attack. Metairie, Louisiana, February 20th, 2021, having murdered 2 people and wounded a couple of others, it's clear that the attacker intended to kill as many people as possible. The quick response by people with concealed handgun permits stopped the attack. I could go on forever. I'm submitting this document. Hopefully my colleagues who sit here and keep saying that a good guy with a gun never stops a bad guy with a gun will read this document. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes? Gentlelady from Texas, seek recognition.
Strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I always look forward to working with the gentleman from Ohio, and I recognize the intent behind this legislation. I would offer to him that the very essence of his amendment is already covered. There's already opportunity to do that for school districts to define who they bring into their school. I think it's worthy to take note of the fact that the Robb Elementary School had a good guy with a gun that was nowhere to be found. Tragic. I think it's worthy to understand that good guys with guns can wind up killing, like a little girl going to dinner in Houston, and some good guy who was robbed way out of the way began to chase her vehicle, driven by her dad, and shot at it. She is dead. So no matter how we try to circumvent, to protect our kids, good guys with guns that can already be handled by school districts and other entities clearly is not the answer. Why are we running away from the crux of the matter? Why are we running away from 19 dead children and 2 beloved teachers and her husband who just died of a broken heart? Why are we running away from Buffalo, white supremacists, hatefulness, and a good guy with a gun, which has been mentioned? But there was body armor and an automatic weapon. Why are we running away from this style weapon as being unnecessary on the streets of America? Why are we running away from bump stocks that helped kill 59 in Las Vegas? Why are we running away? Or am I to not be concerned about my officers, HPD? This is the real ghost gun that shot my police officers in Houston. Why are we running away from this? I appreciate the gentleman's effort. You'll hear me again. The police have told you that what we're doing is correct. Major chiefs, ban bump stock, reinstate the assault weapons ban, ban high-capacity magazines. Everything that we're intending to do. My good friend in Ohio said, I said we're not finished. You're absolutely right. We're planting the seeds, not hysteria, planting the seeds. I'm standing on good ground. I'm siding with Justice Scalia in the Heller case. Why? Because he indicates there's no unlimited use of guns. He clearly said, or the opinion, along with Miller, finds support in the historical tradition of prohibiting the carrying of dangerous and unusual weapons. These are dangerous and unusual. Someone asked me, are you against all assault weapons? Well, there's a long list in the assault weapons legislation that we're thinking about that are exempted. It's not all of them. So that's why I argue for a 7-day waiting period on automatic weapons. But it's good for my friend, my other friend from Ohio, Jabot, to talk about what schools need to do. They're going to be looking at schools. There is a long document that I will hold up about school security that we've already put forward on the federal level. They have a monster load of plans. But a good guy with a gun was missing in action at the elementary school as the parents are crying and saying. A mother said she was blocked from going in to get her children. She went around the school and broke in. We'll get more facts about that, but the issue is there are tools. But why are we sidestepping the crux of our problem? The fact that guns are not stored, the fact that there are ammunition that should be restrained, the facts that we have trafficking, that the age is ludicrous, and that's why the parents have asked me over and over again, why was an 18-year-old getting a gun? And the grandmother who saw this child get it, his gun was not stored or locked up. Maybe he bought it, but maybe the parents should have had the key. They did not, or maybe when he bought it, there should have been some devices for storing. So again, I'm not going to say anything about Mr. Shabbat's amendment other than it can already be done. And it's not on the crux of what we're doing today. Mr. Cabot sent out a message for them to utilize existing law. But you are moving away from what we're dealing with. The killing with these guns and munition, needing to pass the Protect Kids Act. We need to pass it now. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Jordan seek recognition?
Strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
I would yield to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The good guys with the guns here that we're talking about are retired police officers. These are the most highly trained people with weapons that a community can possibly have. These are people that we've trusted to keep us safe, keep our families safe in the past, generally for 25 years or so. These men and women retire oftentimes in their early 50s or so, and they're able to work. Many of them work another 15, even 20 years. It just seems to make sense that places that I think we all agree we need to protect, that's schools, and most importantly, the precious lives within those schools, both the students and the teachers, that you have the best, the most highly trained people of all to protect them, and that's the police officers. Now, we've expanded it to also retired and former military personnel who are honorably discharged. Now, you can have people involved in the military that have problems as well and left under unhonorable circumstances. We're not talking about those folks. We're talking about folks, both our police officers and our military personnel, that our tax dollars have paid for to train to have this expertise. Why not use this expertise for a decade or even 2 decades to protect the most important resources that we have in this country, and that's our children. I'm a former school teacher myself. I taught the 7th and 8th grade in an inner city school. It's been quite a few years ago, and we were fortunate that we didn't have one of these types of incidences occur while I was a teacher there. And most schools don't have that happen, but unfortunately far too many do. And what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have proposed today are a number of items. Many of them will ultimately be declared unconstitutional, or almost identical cases have already been declared to be unconstitutional, yet that's what's ahead here. I'm simply suggesting that we make it more that we let people that could actually get these folks to protect our children within their schools, give them more information about it, make it more known to them that this is available, and that these resources are there. There's other things, of course, that we can do to protect children in those schools too. It's not just police officers. That's an important part of it, but there are other parts of it. And again, I want to compliment John Rutherford, a former sheriff, one of our colleagues from Florida, who had a lot of experience in this area as former law enforcement himself, for pushing not just the police officers, but also metal detectors as an option, more training for the teachers, to try to identify those troubled students who might ultimately somewhere down the road participate in some sort of incident like this where they target fellow students or younger students or anybody for that matter. So, I mean, that makes sense. It also makes sense to train our teachers and our administrative personnel as to when you have a circumstance like this that's happening, what's the best way that you can do to save lives? So all of those things are important. Those are things that we can and are doing right now, but we can do a lot more. And I would suggest, my colleagues, rather than opposing this, which I think is a very common sense thing, which would actually make a difference, I'd say you ought to adopt this and make at least something good in this bill. And I'm willing to discuss some of the other things that my Democratic colleagues have proposed here. But overall, as a package, I just don't think it's helpful. I think it focuses on, well, we've done something, but unfortunately, I don't think it's going to make anybody any safer, especially since a lot of it's going to be probably thrown out as being unconstitutional in any event. We know this is constitutional. We know that tax dollars are already going to this. Let's let schools be more aware.
Mr. Chairman, I cannot hear him.
We've lost his audio and we're waiting for it to be restored, and we've stopped the clock. Mr. Shab, now you can be heard. Okay, proceed.
Okay, I'm not sure exactly where it dropped off at, but I pretty much concluded. I would just urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this common sense amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition? Ms. Escobar.
Mr. I'd move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to say that my heart goes out to Buffalo, Uvalde, Tulsa, and the innumerable communities like my own of El Paso, Texas, communities that have suffered the carnage and trauma of gun violence. I've been listening to my Republican colleagues on this committee for the last 2 hours as they desperately try to rationalize their inaction and their unwillingness to support our legislation. I'd like to speak directly to the American public. Let's be very about what the two sides are actually arguing for. Republicans are trying to convince you that anyone who wants a gun should have unfettered access to one. Whether you want to take a weapon of war into a state that outlaws them, whether you want to be armed with a ghost gun, or whether you're an 18-year-old who wants an assault-style weapon, but who isn't even old enough to drink. You're hearing it over and over this morning. They believe that the only way to solve our gun crisis is by flooding our neighborhoods with more guns. If you want a glimpse at the kind of dark vision they have for America, just look at my state of Texas, which is a perfect example of what they want. In Texas, after the slaughter in El Paso, the governor, Greg Abbott, promised to change our laws, and he did. He loosened them in order to move closer to the dark vision today's Republican Party has for America. In Texas, the age for access to certain guns was lowered from 21 to 18. In Texas, you can now open carry. In Texas, you don't need training. In Texas, you don't need a license. And mind you, this is in Texas where law enforcement begged the state not to do this, and where many school districts have their own police force already, including the school district in Uvalde. Once again, proving that a good guy with a gun mostly doesn't stop a bad guy with a gun, especially when that bad guy has high capacity magazines and an assault style weapon. The guns my Republican colleagues want in our neighborhoods don't just pierce flesh, they destroy it. They shatter muscle, shatter bones, shatter nerves. Their vision of America is one where everyone has a gun. And you heard one of my Republican colleagues describe the Wild West shootouts happening across America as though he's perversely proud of this. The other solution they want is to ensure every public location is hardened. And then we continue on this spiral of violence that is as unique to America as these deadly gun laws are. Not only did none of Greg Abbott's looser gun laws prevent more mass shootings in Texas, but his approach has hastened them. And my Republican colleagues will continue to blame everything else. They'll blame mental illness, video games, single parents, the list goes on and on. But what's the common denominator in gun violence attacks? It's the guns. Democrats aren't asking for anything unreasonable. And in fact, we're following the lead of the American public. I'm following the lead of the majority of my constituents, as well as the victims of gun violence after the August 3rd, 2019 shooting in El Paso. People who have told me over and over again, they want us to do our job. Americans are tired of their children dying. Americans are tired of being afraid to go into grocery stores, outdoor concerts, and now hospitals. To my Republican colleagues, look at Texas, a state that has tried it your way. There's blood everywhere. To the American people, there is an extremism that has gripped the Republican Party. They're addicted to it. They're slaves to it. They post ghoulish photos of themselves with weapons of war and use it as their Christmas cards. They photograph their children with those weapons. They participate in congressional hearings virtually adorned with them. As they continue with their destructive behavior, it's up to serious legislators to listen to the public, do our job, make people safe. I'd love for Republicans to join us, but when they do not, the American public must take heed of which party protects them, protects law enforcement, and protects their children, and which party chooses its ghoulish obsession over all else. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
General Leader yields back. For what purposes Mr. Big seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate Ms. Jackson Lee, who reminded us that the crux of today's hearing is to protect children at schools. And I think that is really important. And I think the reason that Mr. Shabbat's amendment is so important, and the reason I support it, is because it does get at the crux of why we're here today, whereas the 6 bills that are rolled into the Democrats' bill today doesn't get at that. It just doesn't, it simply doesn't get at that. When you add retired police officers and honorably discharged retired veterans to the folks that can come in and help defend schools, you are actually increasing the likelihood that somebody who wants to attack them will be deterred. As Mr. Johnson of Louisiana previously recited today, the manifesto written by the shooter from Buffalo said he was effectively looking for gun-free zones. What a school police officer presence would do would provide deterrence. And really, that is the crux of what we're talking about here today. How do you deter criminally violent people from going in and committing mass shootings and mass murders? So it seems to me perfectly rational to adopt the Shabbat amendment. Now, I will add to some of the times that people with guns do stop bad people, criminally evil people from committing heinous crimes. The Department of Justice has done studies, and one of their studies said that on average, about 1.5 million times a year, people with guns stop violent, heinous acts. In other words, they deter and save lives. They deter violence and save lives. That's what Mr. Shabbat's amendment gets to. I think of a guy named Stephen Williford. He was the guy who stopped the mass shooting in its act in Sutherland Springs, Texas. I had a chance to visit with him with several other members of Congress. He said his biggest regret was that it took him 30 seconds or so to get his weapon out of his gun safe to go over and engage the demonic gunman at Sutherland Springs. He believed that had he been able to get over there even 30 seconds sooner, he would have saved 4 or 5 lives. That's important to put these things in context. The reality is, we know that people with guns and their presence deters bad actors. Does it deter all bad actors? No, but it does deter bad actors. And it deters angry, malevolent people with murderous intent. That's why Mr. Shabbat's amendment is so important. It actually adds to and expands the pool of people who are qualified to come in and help defend our schools. So if the crux of this is really to deter people who will shoot up schools and provide safety, and I believe that's what we're talking about here today, then this amendment is wholesale and whole on and should be adopted. But if the crux of today's hearing is something different, the way the gentleman from New York was talking about, and actually several others have talked about, is it's really to ultimately lay the predicate for taking away the Second Amendment and taking away guns, whether they be an AR-15 or whether they be a 9mm handgun. Well, then that's an entirely different matter, and that should be resolved in a completely different hearing. But if you're talking about deterrence, then Mr. Shabbat's amendment should be adopted, and that's why I support it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Johnson of Georgia seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, we're here for the children, for the kids. We're talking about protecting our kids from out-of-control gun violence in America. You know, it was almost 10 years ago, December the 14th of 2012, when Sandy Hook took place. A 20-year-old armed with an assault weapon murdered 20 children between the ages of 5 and 6 and killed 6 teachers. And at that time, the head of the NRA, Wayne LaPierre, uttered words that Republicans continue to march to today, and that is that the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. It hasn't worked in the schools since Sandy Hook. I watched last week, the nation watched a press conference, Governor Abbott of Texas recounting what allegedly occurred at the school where 19 more children murdered by a guy with a long gun, an 18-year-old. And Governor Abbott was interrupted by my former colleague, Beto O'Rourke, who was just frustrated at what he was hearing. You see, the governor was not telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He talked about, the governor, that there was a school resource officer, a good guy, with a gun who tried to stop the bad guy with the gun. But that turned out not to be true. It was actually 19 good guys wearing white cowboy hats with guns. And they weren't able to stop that 18-year-old with a more powerful weapon than the one that they had. And so today, we're talking about reining in this out-of-control gun violence, which prevents our children from being able to feel secure as they go to school. You know, over the last 10 years, we've had a series of events in this nation where there have been good guys with guns who weren't able to stop the bad guys. 2 weeks ago in Buffalo, New York, 10 people murdered, including an armed security guard and former police officer who shot at the gunman, but the gunman had a bigger gun than he had. And he was this brave former police officer, put his life on the line, and we thank him for that. But he lost his life trying to protect others. Bad guy with a gun, 1. Good guy with a gun, 0. In 2017, police and security guards were present both at the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival in Las Vegas and in the hotel where the shooter was perched and carried out that mass murder. 58 people killed and over 800 injured. Bad guy with a gun, 2. Good guy with a gun, 0. In 2016, at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, an armed security guard shot at the gunman before the gunman went into the club, ultimately killing 49 people. Bad guy with a gun, 3. Good guy with a gun, 0. In 2018, a shooter killed 10 people at Santa Fe High School in Texas, even though there were 2 officers who were on site, and 1 was wounded trying to stop the gunman. Bad guy with a gun, 4. Good guy with a gun, 0. We've listened to my colleagues on the other side recount a series of situations where individuals armed with handguns, protecting themselves and the lives of others, were successful. And I can't argue with that other than to point out that they didn't do it with assault weapons. They had handguns. Earlier in 2018, a school resource officer was on the campus at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, but he couldn't stop the gunman from killing 17 high schoolers. Bad guy with a gun, 5. Good guy with a gun, 0. When will we stop relying upon this failed notion that the only thing that stops bad guys is good guys? Congress can stop some bad guys with some good legislation, and that's what we're here to do today, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back for purposes of Mr. Royce recognition.
Want to ask to speak on the amendment?
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll have more to say on the underlying measure in a little bit. I just wanted to make a couple of comments, just because there's been a lot of reference to what did or did not occur in Uvalde. The district I represent does not contain Uvalde. It borders Texas 21. I know a lot of the people in the community in Uvalde, and including some of the folks involved. I got a phone call last Tuesday because I had been trading messages with the mayor of Uvalde, and then we missed each other. And so then I just asked the mayor what was happening, and the mayor texted me, and pulling it up here, and he said, well, this is before we knew anything. The reports weren't out. He said, the reports it looks like 18 to 20 young kids. The quote, asshole shot them and stacked them like firewood. We've all been reeling since then, knowing what that meant to a community, a close-knit community like Uvalde. And it's horrific, and it's the face of evil. I don't know whether or not a resolution or a sense of Congress by my friend from Ohio will make a significant difference. But I do know, I appreciate what the gentleman is trying to focus on, which is how do we prevent bad actors from carrying out bad acts? And then what do we do in that? And how do we respond to it? There's a lot of commentary going on about what police did or didn't do in the school in Uvalde. And I would just ask for members to respect the process of looking through and determining the facts before we pass judgment. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, made the point that there's still a lot of unknown facts, and there's still investigations underway, state, federal, and local. I've gotten multiple different accounts, even in the last 2 days. We saw yesterday, for example, the day before, the report of the propped open door by the teacher turned out not to be exactly accurate. The door had been propped open, or at least the facts as I currently understand it, the door had been propped open when the teacher went out. That was a violation of protocol, no doubt. But then when she heard gunfire, allegedly went in and knocked the prop out. But then the door didn't lock. All right. Well, that's a fact that I don't even know. Like, go pursue that fact. My point is, the entire country was then saying, well, what's wrong with this teacher who propped this door? And then that caused, well, then imagine, and I happen to know some facts about this, what that meant to that teacher when everybody's out across America saying how, blaming her. And then now focus on the police and blaming, 18 cops or 7 cops or 3 cops. I get a different quote from every person talking about it, standing in the hallway like they're sitting around their thumb up their rear while bad things are happening. Well, that's not true fully based on what I understand from a number of accounts. I'm not here to defend the officers on the scene. I'm not here to criticize the officers on the scene. I'm here to say that let's wait on the damn facts, because these are people and we ought to be making sober judgments about what actually occurred and making policy accordingly. Because what if the hardening and the steel doors were actually part of the difficulty of entering? What if the key wasn't accessible and there wasn't appropriate timing and training for getting the key? I don't know. There are a lot of facts that I'm still waiting to reserve judgment on. I would just ask that our colleagues, both sides of the aisle, to be honest, but I've heard it from my Democratic colleagues today making judgments about cops standing there. And I don't believe that was true for the vast majority of the law enforcement on the scene who are trying to get access to and try to protect those kids. And they don't deserve to be lumped into one group. We can make determinations about who made what decisions when the reports come out, and then pass judgment accordingly. But we're still getting reports and facts on that. I feel really strongly about that. And I believe that no matter where this occurs in the country, get the facts and then figure out policy. There have been a number of things that have been raised about AR-15s. And I don't know how much time I have left because I don't have a clock in front of me, and I apologize for not being in person. I couldn't get a flight to work out for me this morning as I intended. And I have more to say about it, but a lot is being said about the AR-15, about being a weapon of war and what all it can do. And that, going through concrete, going through cinder blocks and, ripping people apart, and that it is a weapon of war. But the fact of the matter is, it's more accurate to say that a Remington 700 bolt action rifle or a 30-06 are weapons of war more than the AR-15, which is not. Now, it's obviously a cousin to some degree, but it is a semi-automatic weapon. And I've heard reference to automatic weapons. The gentlelady from Texas referred to automatic weapons. But you can't get an automatic weapon without a permit. It is a semi-automatic weapon. And I've heard a lot of people here saying, well, why can't you get on board with this legislation? Because, well, it's just limiting a magazine or limiting...
The time of the gentleman has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Georgia seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word in opposition to this amendment.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I am just so really frustrated that our colleagues on the other side, with their responses to the slaughterings in our schools, and, their answer is to provide more people with guns, rather than taking guns out of the hands of people who absolutely should not have access to them. And as we know, there were 19 officers outside of the classrooms at Robb Elementary where a gunman executed child after child after child, one for each child that was taken away from us. This false notion of good guys with guns does not work. That has been disproved over and over and over again. In Buffalo, New York, a security guard with a gun, a retired police officer, in fact, heroically tried to defend the shoppers in the Tops grocery store. But he was shot down by the gunman with an assault weapon. Turning our schools into fortresses is just absolutely not the answer. We cannot ignore our duty to protect our children from being massacred. Yes, improving school safety is vitally important, but sensible gun safety is the fastest way to keep our families safe. Trust me, I am a survivor of gun violence. I am a survivor, a mother of senseless gun violence. We are teetering here in America on the brink of being one of the most civilized, violent nations in the world. If we want to invest in our schools, invest in the mental health of the children and teachers who fear each and every single day that they're in school, they're going to be the next site of a mass shooting. It is imperative that we focus on ensuring that guns are not in the wrong hands so that we are operating on the offense in preventing these shootings from happening in the first place, rather than acting in defense and only offering thoughts and prayers once they occur. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose is Mr. Buck seek recognition?
Speaking on behalf of the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr.
Wait
Chairman.
a minute. Yeah.
I first want to thank the gentleman from Ohio for bringing the amendment. And obviously my Democrat colleagues make a point that not every time a good guy has a gun does he stop a bad guy with a gun. But it does happen on occasion. Not every time that someone locks up a gun in a home do they stop someone in a nearby school from entering and firing a gun. None of these measures that the Democrats have proposed today stop all violence. Mr. Shabbat's amendment is intended to help. It's not intended to, and nobody suggests that it does, eliminate all chances of violence. But I want to respond to the gentlelady from Texas when she talked about the dark vision that Republicans have. I think a lot of people in this country are offended that the lady would go that direction. First of all, she said that anyone who wants to own a gun, Republicans believe anyone who wants to own a gun should be able to get one. I don't believe that. I don't think most of my Republican colleagues, if any, believe that. I think that anybody who has been convicted of a dangerous felony, a violent felony, should not have a gun. I think it's quite obvious that there are people in this country that have forfeited their right to guns. As has been mentioned before, the Second Amendment's not absolute, and we should take that. The gentlelady talked about a dark vision that Republicans have for America, that somehow a good guy with a gun is not able, is not enough to stop a bad guy with a gun. Well, the Democrats have taken away the ability of a good guy to have a gun in a school to stop bad guys. A teacher who wants to bring a gun to school, an administrator, a coach, others can't do that right now. But I also think that, if you want to point out dark visions for America, I think when the Democrats argue for an open border, what they're arguing for is to allow dangerous gang members to come across that border, MS-13 and others, and they have. When they open the border up, they allow dangerous drugs to come across the border, like fentanyl. Leading cause of death for 18 to 45-year-olds in this country is drug overdose. That is a direct relation, that is directly occurs because of the open border policies of this administration, particularly Secretary Mayorkas. When you open a border, you allow terrorists to come across the border. When you open a border, I think it was Mr. Cohen who mentioned earlier about the gun parts that are coming in from China that allow a semi-automatic weapon to be converted into an automatic weapon. That happens by opening a border and letting it come across. But we don't hear Democrats talk about that as a solution to close our border and to get a grip on the terrible things that have been happening as a result of that. The Democrats have promoted a culture of death in this country with their views on abortion. We have late-term abortions, absolutely horrific late-term abortions that somehow the Democrats think, can happen in a vacuum and that it won't have an impact on the rest of society. We have people being paid not to work. Oftentimes, those people are also using drugs, getting money from the government to buy the drugs. We have gas prices skyrocketing in this country. Are those the dark vision of the Democrat Party? I don't think so. I think they're bad policies that have been made by the liberal progressives in the Democrat Party, but I don't think that they're dark vision of the Democrats. And I think what we have to do is make sure we get away from the kind of language that the gentle lady from Texas used to accuse Republicans of having some kind of dark vision. We care deeply about what's happening in our schools. We disagree that these shallow, inconsequential bills will have an impact on that. What I'm asking for, and what many of my colleagues in Congress are asking for, let's have some meaningful discussion on how to get to the bottom line, how to address not the gun, but the person behind the gun, how to address the sickness, the evil that we see in our society that will allow us to get to the point where we are a safer country. And I thank the gentleman from Ohio for offering one small piece of that. And really disappointing that the Democrats won't acknowledge that it is a small piece, but it is a positive step in what we can do. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I first want to say, in response to the gentleman from Texas's comment about why don't we just wait till we understand all the facts of Uvalde with some more investigation underway, he acted as if we've had 2 shootings in America, 2 mass shootings, and we're coming to respond to that. We are responding to thousands and thousands and thousands of shootings in this country over the last decade. And so what have been developed here are developed in response to a gun violence epidemic. No, I will not yield. The idea that we should wait while we can have families that have lost loved ones who are expecting Congress to respond.
Time belongs to the gentleman
as
from Rhode
Mr.
Island.
Roy suggested, that we should just wait to find out. We should be we've waited too long already. We failed to respond to the cries of people all across this country who have asked and demanded that Congress act. So no, we shouldn't wait. We shouldn't wait another second. We shouldn't wait another minute, another day. We should act now. The second thing is, my friend and colleague from Colorado just made reference to this suite of bills as shallow and inconsequential. Shallow and inconsequential. I'm going to go through just a few pieces of this. Ghost guns were used in a shooting in Santa Clara, California that killed 3 people and injured 3 others. Ghost guns were used in November of 2017 in Rancho Tehama, California that injured 18 people. Another shooting in Santa Monica, California that killed 6. Bump stocks were used, as we all know, in Las Vegas that killed 60. Shootings that involved people under 20 years of age. Robb Elementary School, as we know, Uvalde, Texas. Tops Friendly Market, 10 were killed. 22 were killed in Uvalde. Santa Fe High School, 10 were killed. 13 were injured. Parkland, Florida. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, 17 were killed. 17 injured. Newtown. Sandy Hook Elementary School, 27 children were killed. In Columbine, 15 people were killed and 24 were injured. Those individuals would not have been able to buy the gun they bought if the bill that we're going to pass today were the law. Safe storage, the list goes on for pages. So to say inconsequential when it would have saved the lives of many, many people, and as Chairman Nadler said, even if it's one life. So to say it's inconsequential and then to say, let's talk about border security and abortion because all we want to do is avoid responsibility to act in the face of gun violence in this country. Shame on our colleagues. If you don't want to talk about it, you don't want to address it, don't come to the hearing. But honor the memories of those who we have lost to gun violence by taking this issue seriously and being committed to finding solutions. Do you think a grieving mother or father who's watching you wants to hear you talk about abortion and border security? We're trying to respond to gun violence that led to the death of their child. That's what this hearing's about. These families, and sadly there are thousands of families across this country who fall into this category, who have suffered unspeakable pain because Congress has failed to act, and our Republican colleagues in the Senate in particular, in blocking any progress in reducing gun violence in this country. We owe it to their memory. We owe it to the oath that we have taken to protect our constituents, our most solemn responsibility. And people talk about the Second Amendment. We've heard it again today. It's a constitutional amendment. You can't touch it. That is not true. The Supreme Court of the United States has told us that.
Will the gentleman yield?
The Supreme Court of the United States has made it clear that Congress has the authority to impose reasonable restrictions to protect the life and the safety and the security of those we serve. In the same way, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. There is no constitutional right that is absolute. It is balanced with responsibility.
Would the gentleman yield?
And so
on that
all
point?
these claims about, gee, we wish we could do something. We wish we could remove America from this terrible distinction of being a country that has a gun violence epidemic unlike any other country in the developed world. And by the way, if more guns were the answer, we'd live in the safest country in the world. There are more guns in America than people. Our country is awash in guns, and it has produced more and more and more death and more gun violence. So that's not the answer. We've tried it. It doesn't work. We need real solutions so we can go back to our districts and demonstrate to the people we serve we've taken some action that's going to make a difference and help protect lives in communities all across this country. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida, for what purposes? Gentleman from Florida seek recognition.
Strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
He said it right there. What they're upset about is the number of guns in the country. This isn't about, modest age restrictions that are unconstitutional. It's not about better record keeping. They want fewer guns. They think that the answer is fewer guns. And that is what is creating a lot of discomfort among our fellow Americans who cherish their guns and cherish their Second Amendment rights and actually committed no crimes.
They cherish their children, Mr. Gates?
You know what? Their children aren't the ones at risk as a consequence of
All
law-abiding gun owners.
children in America are
That's
at
what
risk.
You get wrong. It's not law-abiding gun owners, David.
Were those children in Uvalde
The gentleman
at
from
risk?
Florida
Here's
has
the
decided.
tension. Here's the tension, okay? You guys are spasming into this reflexive response, and you call it an emergency hearing, right? And the basis for the emergency is what happened in Uvalde. And we all agree it was awful and tragic, but you are not providing the thoughtful solutions that would actually reduce the likelihood of that. When you make an argument in the Judiciary Committee for a change in the law, there are two components. You have to demonstrate a need for the change, and that what you're bringing forward will actually affect that in a positive way. And it's the second part of the argument where the bills you've presented today undeniably fail. And in Florida, I would suggest we had a process that's a little bit better than what we've observed here. In Florida, following Parkland, every Floridian wanted to reduce the likelihood that that could ever occur again for precisely the reasons that animate your passions today. But instead of rushing to town, stumbling bills together, we got our very best sheriffs, our very best police chiefs, former members of law enforcement, people with tactical experience, even parents of slain children. And we put them on a board to review a school shooting as if it were an airline crash, dispassionately, thoroughly. And then as a consequence, what we saw was actually a failure in law enforcement, that the sheriff in Broward County was so recalcitrant in not doing the training, that the on-the-ground law enforcement were so derelict in their duties that children died that didn't need to. And so Governor DeSantis rightly fired that sheriff, replaced them, put better training in, more money to harden our schools and our synagogues, our houses of worship across the state of Florida, and we're safer as a consequence. So it's not that we're particularly here to talk about abortion or the border. We understand we have to make these things less likely, but whether it's you holding an emergency hearing to respond to a leaked draft opinion that's not even final, or now when the Congressman Roy from Texas says, gosh, before you have the emergency Uvalde hearing, maybe we ought to figure out what happened in Uvalde so that we can make that frequency less likely to occur. I think there's also a balancing of interests here that the American people need to understand. You say if it saves one life, anything that saves one life is totally worth doing. And certainly every loss of life is tragic, and certainly every preventable loss of life is tragic. But Mr. Cohen gave up the game earlier when he said, we acknowledge on the front end of this hearing that there will be deprivations of liberty to law-abiding people, that we will at times stop law-abiding people from doing what is otherwise constitutionally legal. So while I certainly want every American to safely store their firearms, while I certainly want every American to be trained on the safe storage of firearms, I'm not entirely sure that the Congress of the United States is the appropriate entity to tell Americans how to store firearms and then punish them as a consequence. And if the result of all of this is there's a a life or two that we save, and the result is, like, how many tens of millions of Americans are you willing to deprive of their constitutionally guaranteed liberty in order to achieve that objective, when there might be a more narrowly constrained appropriate way for gun enthusiast groups, hunting clubs, local government, states, to try to educate and encourage proper safety of the storage of firearms. So again, we share your goal of making these shootings less likely, whether they be in our schools or elsewhere in our communities, but we don't think that in the name of saving one life, that fundamentally constraining the rights of all Americans is necessary, especially when we are still awaiting the results of the review of what happened in Uvalde that shocks the conscience of all of us. So please spare us the spirited screaming. We want to stop the violence. We just wish you would listen to some of the ideas that we think would help. And from my standpoint, if you hold schools out as gun-free zones, as soft targets, you make those school shootings more likely. And I don't think you want to do that. But I think that if we got rid of the gun-free zones and if we empowered people that could be helpful, we might see a reduction in violence. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Move to strike, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized.
The gentleman from Florida said that he and his Republican colleagues want to stop the violence in this country. But it's difficult to believe that when there are common sense steps that Congress can take and they are unanimously obstructing those approaches. I want to elaborate something that my colleague, Mr. Cicilline, said earlier today, because it is clear to me that the more my colleagues misinterpret the Second Amendment and the Supreme Court's decision in D.C. versus Heller, the more they are giving up the fact that they've not actually read those documents. Let's start with the Second Amendment. The text is clear. The amendment protects the collective right of the people as a whole to possess arms solely for the purpose of forming a well-regulated militia. Now, last time I checked, the National Guard doesn't depend on teenage boys owning semi-automatic rifles with high-capacity magazines. Notice that while the Second Amendment is explicit that the government has the authority to regulate the use of arms, the Second Amendment does not include a single word, not one word, about an individual right to own a gun. In fact, the claim that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to own a gun is so indefensible that even the conservative former Chief Justice Warren Burger, a Nixon appointee, no less, had once denounced it as, quote, one of the greatest pieces of fraud on the American public he had ever heard. No wonder the Supreme Court never recognized an individual right to own a gun from the ratification of the Constitution in 1789. Until 2008, when the Roberts Court's far-right majority issued its 5-4 opinion in Heller. So let's talk about Heller. Yes, Heller did set a constitutional baseline that there is a right to own a handgun for self-defense in the home. But even in that egregiously mistaken decision, the court made clear that we can still regulate gun ownership and possession, particularly in sensitive places, as well as prohibit an individual from possessing firearms. As the late Justice Scalia's opinion explains, quote, like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. And, quote, the right was not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever, in any manner whatsoever, and for whatever purpose. In fact, Justice Scalia went out of his way to emphasize that the sort of measures we are considering today would be plainly constitutional. He wrote, quote, "Nothing in our opinion, nothing should be taken to cast doubt on laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places, such as schools and government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms." And he continued that, quote, "Another important limitation on the right to keep and carry arms is that only, quote, the sorts of weapons protected were those in common use at the time. The Constitution does not condemn us to allow weapons of war to flood our neighborhoods. Make no mistake about that." My colleague's desperate citation to an outlier ruling by 2 Trump appointees in 1 circuit, and when have they ever been fans of the 9th Circuit, as my colleague Mr. Neguse pointed out earlier, does not change the reality of what the Supreme Court has said. That is why even more circuits have upheld age restrictions on firearm purchases. The 5th Circuit has twice upheld restrictions on particular weapons for 18 to 21-year-olds. The Supreme Court declined to weigh in both of those times, allowing the 5th Circuit to be the final word in upholding these age restrictions. And the 1st and 7th Circuits have upheld age restrictions as well. Activist, Trump-appointed judges may be trying to change settled law, just as they are trying to roll back decades of settled law upholding the right to an abortion. But don't believe the lie that they are selling, a lie so radical that even the far-right Roberts Court hasn't endorsed it. Age restrictions are nothing new, and they are consistent with the Second Amendment. So I've heard enough, and I think I speak for my Democratic colleagues when I say this, of ill-informed, bad faith constitutional misinterpretations. The Constitution is no obstacle to protecting our kids in America today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Bishop seek recognition?
To speak on the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
And in response to the comments just made, I'm glad this comes together this way, because I've been wanting to knock down some canards and some straw men arguments that have been offered by the majority. But to that point, with the points just made by the gentleman from New York, who earlier made clear, because he said it literally, that he will use all means necessary to reverse the Supreme Court, not through the processes of the Supreme Court, but by changing it institutionally, by packing it, by getting rid of the filibuster, overriding institutional norms as usual. But to the point just argued, the central holding of Heller is that the Second Amendment confers an individual right. That is the core of Heller. It's what the left went berserk about because you don't want that right to be recognized. Mr. Jones then comes forth, making my argument perhaps better than I can, saying that his main objective is to see to it that that individual right recognized in Heller no longer continues to apply.
Sir, will the gentleman yield?
Let me finish. No, I won't. You had a great opportunity there.
That you are now misconstruing.
The statement has been made by Mr. Cicilline, by Mr. Deutsch, by Mr. Jones, by the President of the United States, that the Second Amendment is not absolute, that it's not without limits. No one has contended that it is without limits. But Heller gives clear indications to what limits are permissible. You read from some of them. What is unlikely, and the Ninth Circuit case falls in the right resolution on that, the Fourth Circuit case earlier, the recognition by the dissent by Judge Wynn in the Fourth Circuit in the same case, is that 18 to 20-year-olds are covered by the Second Amendment first. And the second point is that bans of widely prevalent firearms and acquainted mechanisms are, you can't do that. Another thing Heller said you can't do is require people to lock them up in their homes so they can't be accessed to provide for their main purpose, which is the right of self-defense of home and hearth.
The gentleman yield.
No, I will not. I'm going to get this out so that somebody hears it. The President of the United States said the other day, the President said, another misnomer, or another factually inaccurate point, you couldn't buy a cannon when the Second Amendment was adopted. It actually is false. It's been debunked repeatedly, but he keeps repeating it. So when you come in and say, we can't, I'm making the argument, you attribute to those of us on our side who are raising the question of the constitutionality of what you propose. I do not make the argument that the Second Amendment is absolute or unlimited. What I make the point about is Heller held what it held. McDonald held what it held. That was the Supreme Court of the United States. Do you acknowledge that baseline or do you not? Mr. Jones has made clear repeatedly that he does not. When we've raised these points about what other courts are deciding about the 18 to 20-year-olds being governed by being covered, they have a right under that amendment, number one. And number two, that some limitations are impermissible. And those you propose in this bill, 3 of them. I said 2 earlier, I was mistaken, 3. You want to ban a whole class of weapons to 18 to 20-year-olds, number one. Number 2, you want to impose the same kind of disability or disabling requirement mandate in the home of weapons that Heller said is impermissible. And finally, you want to ban magazines that have the number that are predominant, that are prevalent everywhere in the country. Heller said you can't do that. So you've got to contend with why, at least if you say the Ninth Circuit, well, it's great for you guys to cite the Ninth Circuit, you don't respect the Ninth Circuit. Yeah, the Ninth Circuit is liberal. That's why it's so remarkable that even they have said that this is something that can't be done. You can't ban a class of weapons to people 18 to 20. So I'm glad to undertake things that we can do. Let's talk about them. But when you start talking about things you can't do, and then you couple that with statements that essentially say, I'm going to get rid of the Second Amendment by any means
the gentleman
necessary. Yeah, I'll yield to you.
What do you support? Like, what are you willing to do to stop the epidemic of gun violence in this country? Because you just referenced that, so I would love for you to articulate the efforts that you would be willing to undertake with your Democratic colleagues in this chamber today to stop the epidemic of gun violence in this country, sir.
You look at what's happening, and then you actually do things that would address that.
So you're not going to answer the question because you don't actually have an approach other than to allow the status quo to remain?
Yeah, I wouldn't let teachers prop doors open. I would make sure that police are not discouraged from going in and saving children who are being assaulted while the assault is going on. I would not intimidate the police and tell them they ought to cease to exist. My time's expired.
I can translate that for you. He's willing to do nothing.
That sounds right to me.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Just a couple of points, Mr. Chairman. First of all, the assertion that Heller prevents us from taking the action that we're taking today is just a misreading of Heller. And I'll leave it to the scholars to look at what was struck down in Heller and what we're proposing here. And the reference to the Ninth Circuit is, okay, I understand it's the liberal circuit that my colleagues like to point to. Forget who the judges were in this case. The fact is there are other circuits who have ruled otherwise. And we all know it's the Supreme Court who has the last word. So let's just be clear about that. But I have to respond to what Mr. Gates said. I know that there are families in the room there today who lost loved ones in Newtown. And I know that there are people watching all around the country, including a lot of my constituents, 17 families, in fact, whose loved ones will never come home. And the 60 families from Las Vegas and 49 families from Orlando and Virginia Tech, the Virginia Tech shooting, 32 people killed, that was in 2007. This idea, this argument that we're rushing into action, that we're not being thoughtful, that we should just take some time to really understand what happened before we respond, is another way of saying we have no interest in ever responding, in ever doing anything to stop this gun violence epidemic in our country. That's the message that it's sending. You can't sit there, with all due respect to my colleagues, you cannot sit as a member of the House of Representatives and tell my constituents that it's just too soon for us to rush in to figure out what kind of legislation we should pass. we haven't had time to really fully digest what happened in Uvalde or Buffalo or any other mass shooting that has taken place in the more than 4 years since that awful Valentine's Day in Parkland. And when Mr. Gates talks about what the state legislature did, the way he characterizes it is we all got together and we came up with all kinds of things that we could do that are so radically different than what we're trying to do here today. In fact, what the Florida legislature did was come together in a bipartisan way and raise the age to buy an AR-15 to 21, to buy any gun to 21. That's what the Florida legislature did. Let's be clear about it. You know what else they did? They passed a red flag law because they understand that if you give law enforcement the ability to take action so that someone who poses a threat to himself or herself shouldn't have a firearm, and that you build in appropriate due process rights, that's the appropriate thing to do. That's what we're going to do next week also. That's what Florida did. So it just pains me. I think it pains all of us. And frankly, anyone who's watching what we're doing here today, to look at this debate and to be told that Congress is just rushing headlong into doing something without giving it appropriate thought. There are people in my community whom all of you know at this point, because they've devoted their lives to honoring the memories of their loved ones who were slaughtered, struck down, taken from them at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. They do not deserve to be told that we have to really dig in and spend more time figuring out how to respond to these mass shootings before we can take action. They don't. No other family who's suffering without a loved one, the hole that leaves forever. What we're doing here today is reasonable. Anyone who looks at these proposals knows that they're reasonable. And in fact, consistent with what's been done in my own state of Florida, run by a Republican legislature and a Republican governor. Let's come together and pass this legislation and help to save lives. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes? Mr. McClintock seek recognition.
Speak on the Shabbat amendment under the 5 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I think the reason we don't often hear about mass shootings that were stopped by a citizen with a gun is that they didn't become mass shootings precisely because they were stopped by a citizen with a gun. As I said earlier, a mass shooting was stopped by a woman with a gun in Charleston, West Virginia, the very day after the massacre at Uvalde. She couldn't have done that in a so-called gun-free school zone. Is there any other possible way to stop a bad guy with a gun, but with a good guy with a gun? There is no other way. The only question is how long it takes. It's often been said that police can be there in minutes when seconds count. And what we found in Uvalde and before in Parkland, even when the police respond, they don't always act once they get there. Those who are directly threatened by a gunman are those who are in the best position to stop such an attack because they're there on the spot and their lives depend on it. And yet you won't let them. That's stunning to me. Nor do you seem to be serious about enforcing our laws when they're violated. I mean, that's what we've observed time and again from your woke district attorneys. And if you don't take our laws seriously, what makes you think criminals will? And again, I ask, why hasn't Hunter Biden been prosecuted for violating the law that forbids drug addicts from purchasing firearms, a felony? Remember, his gun, which he illegally obtained by lying on his application, yet another felony, ended up being retrieved from an open trash can 500 feet from the school. So again, I pose the question, what makes you think gun laws will keep guns out of the hands of criminals any better than drug laws keep drugs out of the hands of addicts? MS-13 isn't going to obey your laws. Madmen aren't going to obey your laws. Terrorists won't obey them either, nor will criminals. All your measures do is make it lawfully impossible for law-abiding citizens to defend themselves. So why won't you protect our children in their schools with the same seriousness as we protect our money at the bank. Nobody questions the common sense of having an armed guard, but leftists somehow cannot see the common sense of having an armed guard at a school. They seem more serious about protecting our money than protecting our children. That's utterly inexplicable to me. And of course, this discussion raises the question of how many bank robberies never happen because robbers know there's an armed guard to return fire, and how many attacks on schools can be discouraged when the gunmen know they're likely to be opposed with lethal force at the front door. You know, the left lives in this fantasy world where all they have to do is pass a law against a criminal from obtaining a gun to have it obeyed. Yet, as King Canute demonstrated, there are limits to the efficacy of our laws. The madmen in Uvalde didn't obey them, but everyone else around that gunman did, and that made them defenseless. And so he operated with impunity in an environment where the gunman was king. And he knew that was a safe environment for him to do violence, as his own diary noted, because he knew no one would be there to return fire. When are my friends going to take the world as it is and not as they wish it to be? The father of modern policing, Sir Robert Peel, once observed that the police are simply the extension of the community, that in fact, the community is the police and the police are the community. Every citizen has a right and a duty to uphold the law and protect themselves. The police are there to help. The only difference, he said, was that the police officer is a professional hired to attend to his duty full-time, not to replace the private citizen, but to support him. Mr. Shabbat's amendment makes it more likely an attack can be stopped before it starts and makes it less likely that a gunman will target our schools knowing they can be stopped before they start. And I say again, until you're ready to protect our children with force, you're not serious about protecting our children at all. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm really pretty disappointed by some of the rhetoric and arguments and positions that have been advanced today. And I think it's important to just refresh ourselves with some facts. Gun is now the leading cause of death for the children of America. America is basically the only country in the world that experiences mass shootings constantly on a regular basis. Countries that have regulated assault weapons and taken action don't have solved these problems. Take a look at New Zealand and Australia. You know, we have to do something. Americans are experiencing an unacceptable level of violence because of the prevalence of assault weapons by unstable people. And what is being recommended here is modest, but would do some good. You know, in my own district, we've experienced this trauma. In 2019, at the annual Gilroy Garlic Festival, a young man with an assault weapon, an semi-automatic rifle, killed 3 people and wounded 17 others before killing himself. Now, California has strong gun controls, but he went over to Nevada and purchased these weapons and then brought them back to California. That's why we need to have a nationwide approach. Now, even if we can't stop all gun violence through these measures, the common sense provisions in the bill before us today will do some good and it will save lives. And I'd just like to say that the recent polling indicates that 89% of Americans support universal background checks. 86% of Americans support red flag laws, and a whopping 70% of Republican and Republican-leaning voters support universal background checks. We do know that gun violence can be countered through some of these provisions. You know, I was out listening to constituents in the last couple of days, and several of my constituents, gun owners, came up to me pleading with me to do something. They pointed out that in their view, it was unwise to allow immature individuals, 18, 19-year-old kids, to go out and buy legally assault weapons. And as one of my constituents said, you know, that kid can't go out and buy a beer. That kid can't go out and rent a car till he's 25, but we're selling these lethal weapons to him. That doesn't make any sense. So I hope that we can stop being the only country on earth where mass shootings are a near daily occurrence. And I think part of achieving that will be to pass the bill before us and to stop talking and throwing dirt in the air and confusing the situation with extraneous discussion. I think we owe the American people better than that. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purposes Ms. Dean seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
I just wanted to tell a story about how I started my day. It's one of the best ways to start a day. I started it with school students. Abington High School, junior high school, members of the National Honor Society, 8th, 9th, 10th graders. And they had a series of questions for me. They wanted to know about how I got into this line of work, what inspired me to do it. But guess what? That all got set aside because their first 3, 4, 5 questions were about us. What are we doing to make them safer in school? What are we doing to make them safer on their playgrounds, in their grocery stores, in their synagogues, in their churches, and on and on and on. These wise, beyond their years, 8th, 9th, 10th graders from Abington School District asked, what are we doing? And I tried to say the very thing we're here to do today is to respond. I know it's later than it ever should have been, was to respond to the scourge of gun violence in this country. When I ran for Congress in 2018, I remember going to meeting after meeting and telling folks, parents, voters, what I care about. I said, I care about the problem of gun violence in this country. I want to do something about it. It is not right that our children are now fearful to go to school, don't feel secure in their school. And one father stood up, this was 2018, one father stood up and really hollered at me. He said, you care about gun violence? What do I do with my 3rd grader who last night couldn't fall asleep because they had an active shooter drill and they were coached to find scissors, run and throw scissors, weapons at the would-be shooter? What are we teaching our children? So I want those Abington High School students to have hope that there are leaders across this dais. Join us. Say that you take this problem seriously. Say that you believe you have to save lives. Stop saying we got to study this some more as the coffins are going in the ground. We don't have to study this. We know what the problems are. Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
I thank the gentlelady from Pennsylvania for her kindness and her indulgence. And I want to answer her question by saying that we will do something. I'm absolutely disturbed by the continuation of insanity. And I can say that because I have sat in this room, my fellow colleagues, and this insanity has continued every time we come to this moment in history. And it continues on the bodies of dead children and dead Americans, not at war, but in their homes, their communities, their schools. It is important that we move away from this constant babble of rejection. And I beg to differ with the interpretation of my friends, because it is not an interpretation of the Constitution, which is a living document. There have been several cases on making it very clear that there are limitations to gun use. It is actually ignoring the fact that we are proud in America of, one, being the overseers of democracy and a constitution that is alive, that is breathing. That is the argument Mr. Jones was making. But the rejection comes from overall tone deafness and the sense that continues to have a crowd of people that want to hear insanity. And the reason why it is, because if again you read the case of one of the most conservative jurists in the Heller case, it continues to say it finds support in the historical tradition. This is in the case. Common use at the time finds support in historical tradition of prohibiting the carrying of dangerous and unusual guns. Pages 54 to 56. Or that certain people that are felons or mentally ill should not have possession of firearms. Or that they should not be in sensitive places like schools and government buildings. I already said to Mr. Cap Shabbat that we can do these things, that they're already able to be done. But this is what I have to contend with in a state that has absolutely no relevant gun laws. And I will recite them time after time: Dallas, Luby's, Walter, Wedgwood, Fort Hood, Second Fort Hood, Dallas Police. This is Texas, Texas First Baptist, Santa Fe, El Paso, Midland, Uvalde. How many dead persons? 183 injuries, 153 dead. This is insanity. The pain of Rhonda Hurt because her daughter, Kimberly Vaughn, the mother of Ethan, is in this room. She doesn't mind me saying. Who knows her pain? Insanity that is going over and over again. The commitment, Congressman Dean, is that we will do something, and that the Constitution allows us to do something, that the case law allows us to do something. And I would think the names of these dead children and the two beautiful teachers and her husband, imperative that we do something, ensures that we must do something. We will join that babbling of insanity if we do not do something. I refuse to do that. We will do something. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Time of the gentlelady yields back. The question occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll. No, the clerk will not call the roll. At this time, the committee will take a brief 15-minute recess.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, can you get mine? I don't want to run over you. Good stuff that you're giving me. I've got to talk about Kimberly Vaughn's bill at one of the moments.